Good evening and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand before a door you were never meant to open? A threshold sealed not by human hands, but by beings whose names were already ancient when the first cities rose from the mud? What if such a door was real? And what if the instructions for finding it, or at least the memory of its sealing, survived on a fragment of clay pressed by fingers that have been dust for 4,000 years? If you find yourself here tonight settling into the quiet hours, and if this kind of question brings you a strange comfort, then perhaps you might consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing if you have not already done so. Do so only if it feels right, only if these long journeys into the deep past help you find a little peace before sleep. And if you would, drop a comment below telling us where you are in the world right now and what time it is as you listen. There is something grounding in knowing that others, scattered across time zones and continents, are drifting through the same story at the same moment, each alone and yet accompanied by the same quiet voice. Now then, soften the lights if you can. Let the fan turn gently in the background, or the hum of the night settle around you. Breathe slowly and let your shoulders drop. There is no urgency here, no deadline, no test at the end. Only the slow unfolding of something very old and very strange and very human. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. We begin not with the tablet itself, but with the land that shaped the people who would one day press its surface into being. We begin in the place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, a cradle of reeds and silt and wide flat skies that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. If you had been there in the earliest days, long before any door was sealed, long before any god had a written name, you would have seen the Tigris and the Euphrates carving their way down from the distant northern highlands, carrying snowmelt and mountain soil southward into the great alluvial plain that lay like a sleeping hand open to the Persian Gulf. The rivers did not run straight. They twisted and wandered, season by season, year by year, and the people who lived along their banks learned to read the rhythms of rising and falling water as carefully as they read the movements of the stars. In the dry season, the channels shrank to shallow braids of current threading between banks of cracked mud, and the heat pressed down on the land with a weight that turned the air itself into something thick and shimmering. Then, as winter gave way to spring, the rivers swelled with the memory of northern rains and melting snow, and the water spread out over the fields in broad, shallow floods that brought both danger and blessing. The danger was obvious. Homes built too close to the banks could vanish overnight, swept away by the muddy churn of a river that had changed its mind. But the blessing was greater, for the floodwaters carried fresh silt, fine and dark and rich, and when they receded they left behind a skin of fertility that would grow barley and emmer wheat, dates and onions, lentils and chickpeas, if the people were patient and clever enough to hold the water where they wanted it. So they dug channels. They piled earth into low walls. They diverted the smaller streams and let them pool in basins that would feed the fields long after the rivers had withdrawn. This was not the work of a single season or a single lifetime. It was the work of generations, each one inheriting the canals and ditches of their parents and adding to them, deepening them, extending them, repairing the breaks that the next flood would inevitably bring. There were no grand palaces yet, no ziggurats towering against the sky. There were only villages of reed huts clustered on low mounds that lifted them just above the waterline, and the people who lived in those huts were farmers and fishers, weavers and potters, men and women who rose with the sun and worked the land and the water until the light began to fail. Their tools were simple: stone blades set into wooden handles for cutting reeds, digging sticks hardened in fire for breaking soil, clay scooped from the riverbanks and shaped by hand into bowls and jars and seals, nets woven from fibre to catch fish in the shallows. They kept sheep and goats, and in time they learned to yoke the ox to the plough, though that knowledge came slowly, passed from one settlement to the next like a whispered secret. They did not write yet. They did not need to. Memory was enough. The oldest woman in the village could recite the names of her grandmothers back 5 or 6 generations, and the oldest man could remember which fields had flooded in his grandfather's time and which had stayed dry. They marked their jars with simple signs, scratched into the wet clay before firing, so that one household's grain could be told from another's, but these marks were not words. They were pictures, shorthand, a way of saying, "This is mine, this is yours, this is ours." The sky above them was enormous, At night, when the work was done and the fires burned low, they would lie on their backs on reed mats and watch the stars turn overhead in their slow and perfect circles. They saw patterns there, animals and gods and stories, and those stories were told and retold until they became as fixed as the stars themselves. There was the bull of heaven, and the scorpion, and the bright wandering lights that were not stars at all but something else, something that moved with intention and purpose through the fixed constellations. They did not yet call those lights planets, and they did not yet write down the math that would predict their movements, but they watched, and they remembered, and that watching was the beginning of something that would grow into science and priesthood and power. In the long stretches between planting and harvest, when the work was lighter, they gathered in the evenings to share food and beer, a thick and nourishing brew made from barley, drunk through long reeds to filter out the sediment. They sang songs whose melodies have not survived, and they told stories about the world and how it came to be. These stories varied from village to village, but certain themes repeated. There was always water, and there was always a time before order, a time of chaos and mingling and formlessness. There were beings greater than human, figures who shaped the land and set the rivers in their courses and separated the sky from the earth. Some stories said these beings were born from the water itself, from the mingling of salt and fresh, the ocean and the river meeting in a boundary zone where life began. Other stories said they descended from the sky, or rose from beneath the ground, or simply were, having no beginning because they were the beginning. The people did not think of these beings as distant or abstract. They were present in the land, in the water, in the grain that sprouted and the fish that swam and the storms that came without warning. If the harvest was good, it was because the beings were pleased. If the river rose too high and swept away the fields, it was because the beings were angry or careless, or teaching a lesson that the people would have to interpret as best they could. There was no separation yet between the sacred and the ordinary. Everything was sacred, or nothing was, which amounted to the same thing. As the centuries turned, the villages grew. Some remained small, a dozen families clustered around a well, or a good stretch of riverbank. Others grew into something larger, small towns where several hundred people lived and worked and traded with their neighbours, and a few, through a combination of location and leadership and simple luck, grew into centres of real power, places where the surplus grain was stored in common buildings, where craftsmen could specialise in pottery or weaving or metalwork, because they no longer needed to spend all their time growing food, where the stories of the gods began to be formalised and repeated in ritual, rather than improvised around the fire. It was in these centres that the first temples appeared. They were modest at first, hardly larger than a prosperous family's home, but they were set apart by their placement on raised platforms and by the care taken in their construction. The walls were made of mud brick, each brick shaped by hand in wooden moulds, and left to dry in the sun before being stacked and mortared with more mud. The interior was a single room, or sometimes two, and at the far end stood a low platform where offerings could be placed. Bowls of barley, cuts of meat, jars of beer, woven cloth, small figurines carved from stone or moulded from clay. These offerings were for the being who lived in the temple, or who was believed to visit it, a being whose presence was invisible but undeniable, felt in the cool air of the inner chamber and in the flickering of the oil lamps that burned there day and night. Each temple had its keeper, a man or woman chosen by the community or by the previous keeper, someone who knew the hymns and the gestures and the calendar of festivals that mark the year. This person was not yet a priest in the sense that later generations would understand the word. They were more like a steward, a caretaker, someone who maintained the relationship between the people and the being who watched over them. They accepted the offerings and redistributed them, some burned or poured out as gifts to the divine, and some returned to the people as shared meals during festivals. They interpreted dreams and signs, advised on planting and harvest dates, mediated disputes when two families both claimed the same field or the same section of canal. The temple became the centre of the community in a way that no single family's home could be. It was the place where grain was stored and debts were remembered. It was the place where agreements were made and witnessed. It was the place where the young were taught the old songs, and where the sick came to sleep in hopes that the temple's resident power would send a healing dream. And it was the place where the first experiments in record-keeping began, because as the communities grew, memory alone was no longer enough. Imagine for a moment the problem. A farmer brings 10 baskets of barley to the temple at harvest time, and the temple keeper accepts them and promises that the farmer will receive a share of oil and wool when those goods are available. But by the time the oil and wool arrive, months have passed, and a dozen other farmers have made similar arrangements, and the keeper, though diligent, cannot possibly remember every detail of every transaction. So the keeper begins to make marks. A small lump of clay is pressed flat, and while it is still soft, a sharpened reed is used to draw a picture of a basket, and next to it, a series of small circular impressions to represent the number 10. The clay is left to dry, and later, when the oil arrives, the keeper can look at the clay and remember, yes, this man brought 10 baskets, and so he is owed this portion. These marks were not writing, not yet, but they were the seed from which writing would grow. Over generations, the pictures became simpler, more abstract, easier to press quickly into the clay. The basket became a few lines and a curve. The numbers became standardized, a system of marks that everyone trained in the temple could recognize. And then slowly, the marks began to stand not just for things, but for sounds, for the syllables of words, and once that leap was made, there was no limit to what could be recorded. A name, a prayer, a story, a law, a recipe, a lament, a prophecy, a memory of something lost. The people who lived in this land, this wide, flat world of rivers and reeds and endless sky, did not think of themselves as Sumerians. That name would come later, given to them by others, by the Akkadian-speaking peoples who would eventually dominate the region and look back on the earlier inhabitants as something both primitive and mysteriously advanced. The people themselves called their land by many names, each city and region with its own dialect and its own identity, but they shared a language and a way of writing and a set of stories that bound them together even when they fought each other over water rights and boundary stones. In the cool hours before dawn, when the sky was still dark but the birds had begun to sing, the farmers would walk out to their fields with hoes over their shoulders and the smell of damp earth rising to meet them. The irrigation channels ran straight and true, bordered by narrow paths worn smooth by generations of feet, and the water in the channels moved slowly, barely a whisper, carrying the lifeblood of the land from the river to the fields. The barley grew in long rows, green and supple in the early months, then golden and heavy-headed as the season turned. The harvest was the work of the whole community, men and women and children moving through the fields with sickles, cutting the stalks close to the ground, and bundling them into sheaves that would be carried back to the threshing floor. The threshing floor was a circle of packed earth, hardened and smoothed by use, and the sheaves were spread out in the sun and beaten with flails or trampled by oxen driven round and round until the grain was separated from the chaff. Then came the winnowing, tossing the mixture into the air with wooden shovels so that the wind could carry away the lighter chaff and let the heavier grain fall back to the ground. It was dusty work, and hot, and by the end of the day everyone was covered in a fine layer of grit and sweat. But there was satisfaction in it, the visible proof of survival for another year. The grain was poured into large jars and sealed with clay stoppers, and the jars were carried to the temple storerooms or to the household's own reserves. Some would be ground into flour, some kept whole for planting the next season, some traded for goods the household could not produce on its own: cloth, pottery, fish, dates, oil pressed from sesame seeds. The economy was not based on money, not in the way later civilizations would understand it. Value was measured in quantities of grain, and exchanges were negotiated face to face, with the temple often serving as witness and intermediary. In the evenings, after the work was done, families gathered in the courtyards of their homes, small open spaces enclosed by mud brick walls, where the air was a little cooler and the stars were visible overhead. Children played quiet games in the last light, and mothers nursed infants while the older women prepared the evening meal. The diet was simple but sufficient: barley porridge flavoured with onions or garlic, bread baked in domed clay ovens, lentil stew, dried fish, dates for sweetness. On special occasions there might be mutton or goat, roasted over an open fire, the fat dripping and hissing into the flames. The men sat together and spoke of the things men spoke of: the condition of the canals, the behaviour of the river, the rumours from other villages, the decisions that would need to be made in the coming weeks. The women sat together and spoke of children and health, and the small dramas of daily life, and the boundary between the two groups was permeable, voices drifting back and forth, laughter shared. When the last light faded, oil lamps were lit, small clay dishes filled with sesame oil and fitted with twisted flax wicks that burned with a steady, gentle flame. The light was soft and warm, just enough to see faces and hands, and in that light the stories were told. These were the stories of the beginning, the stories of the gods, though the word gods is perhaps too formal, too rigid. The beings in the stories were more like vast persons, powerful and strange and not always comprehensible, but persons nonetheless, with desires and quarrels and moments of tenderness. There was the story of the separation of heaven and earth, when the two were torn apart so that space could exist for living things. There was the story of the creation of humans, fashioned from clay and the blood of a slain god, made to do the work that the gods themselves had grown tired of doing. There was the story of the flood, the great deluge sent to wipe away a world that had grown too noisy, too chaotic, too full of itself, and the single man who was warned in time to build a boat and save himself and his family and the seed of all living things. And there were quieter stories too, stories about individual gods and their relationships with one another. Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, who lived in the depths of the underground ocean and knew all secrets and all craft. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, stern and powerful, who could bless or destroy with equal ease. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, fierce and beautiful and unpredictable, who descended to the underworld and returned, who loved and lost and raged and triumphed. These figures were not distant. They walked through the stories as vividly as any human character, and the people listening could see them, could imagine their faces and their voices, could feel the weight of their presence. But even in those early stories there were hints of something else, a theme that would surface again and again in different forms. The gods were not permanent. They came and they acted, and sometimes they withdrew. They sealed things, they hid things, they departed. The stories did not always explain why or where they went, only that there had been a time when the divine and the human were closer, and that time had passed, or was passing, and what remained were the traces, the temples, the rituals, the offerings, the hope that the connection could be maintained even as the distance grew. The rivers kept flowing, the seasons kept turning, the people planted and harvested and built and remembered, and the land slowly transformed under their hands from a wilderness of reeds and water into a patchwork of fields and canals and villages, each one a small triumph of order against the chaos that always waited at the edges, ready to return the moment vigilance faltered. The first scribes did not think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as keeping accounts, as making sure that what was given and what was owed could be remembered beyond the limits of a single human mind. The temple storerooms were growing larger, the transactions more complex, and the old methods of clay tokens and simple pictographs were no longer quite enough. So the system evolved, slowly, over generations, as these things always do when necessity and ingenuity meet in the hands of people who have the patience to experiment and the authority to enforce a standard. The writing began as pictures, as we have said, but pictures are cumbersome. A picture of a cow requires a certain number of strokes, a certain care in rendering, and if you need to write the word cow 100 times in a single day, the effort becomes exhausting. So the scribes simplified. The cow became a few lines, a wedge for the body, a wedge for the head, a curve suggesting horns. And because the tool they used was a cut reed with a triangular tip, pressed into soft clay, the lines naturally took on a wedged shape, a shape that would give the script its later name, cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. As the pictures became simpler and more abstract, something remarkable happened. The marks began to detach from the things they had originally depicted. A picture of a mouth could mean mouth, but it could also mean the sound of the word for mouth, and that sound could be used as part of another word that had nothing to do with mouths at all. This was the Great Leap, the moment when writing stopped being a mere memory aid and became a tool for capturing language itself, with all its subtlety and flexibility. A scribe could now write not just barley delivered, 10 baskets, but also the name of the man who delivered it, and the date, and the reason, and a note about the quality of the grain, and a reminder that payment was still pending. The scribes were trained in the temple schools, or in the palace schools once palaces emerged, and the training was rigorous. It began in childhood, often around the age of 7 or 8, when a boy, and occasionally a girl, though this was rare, would be apprenticed to a master scribe. The student would begin by learning the basic signs, hundreds of them, each one practiced over and over on cheap clay tablets that could be smoothed and reused. The master would press a sign into a clay model, and the student would copy it, and the master would check the copy and correct the angle of the wedges, the spacing, the pressure. Too light and the mark would be illegible, too heavy and the clay would tear. The student learned by repetition, by muscle memory, by the slow accumulation of small perfections. They learned the signs for numbers, for grain, for oil, for silver, for sheep, for cattle, for land. They learned the signs for gods and kings and cities. They learned the signs that represented sounds, syllables that could be combined into any word the language required. And they learned the conventional arrangements, the formulas that began every contract and every letter and every hymn, the polite phrases and the legal phrases and the sacred phrases that had been handed down from earlier generations of scribes and were not to be altered without good reason. The work was hard. The students sat cross-legged on the floor or on low benches, their tablets resting on their knees, and they worked in silence under the watchful eye of the master. Mistakes were not tolerated lightly. A student who was careless or lazy might be struck with a rod, or made to stand in the corner, or given extra work, copying the same text over and over until the hand ached and the signs blurred before the eyes. But a student who showed promise, who took care with the work and demonstrated an understanding not just of the mechanics, but of the meaning, such a student would be praised and given more advanced text to copy, and eventually trusted to compose their own documents under the master's supervision. The tablets themselves were small, usually no larger than a hand, and rectangular, with rounded edges. The clay was prepared by kneading it to remove air bubbles, then flattened into a smooth surface. The scribe would hold the tablet in the left hand, if right-handed, and the stylus in the right, and would begin at the upper left corner, pressing the wedges in neat rows from left to right, top to bottom. When the text was complete, the tablet would be left to dry in the sun, or if the document was important, it would be baked in a kiln to harden it permanently. Baked tablets could last for thousands of years, and indeed many thousands have survived, buried in the ruins of ancient buildings, waiting for the archaeologists who would one day unearth them and bring their words back into the light. The scribes recorded everything: contracts for the sale of land, loans of silver, marriage agreements, divorce settlements, adoption papers, wills, inventories of temple goods, lists of workers and their rations, receipts for taxes paid in grain or labour, letters between kings, between merchants, between family members separated by distance, hymns to the gods, prayers for protection, incantations against disease and demons, instructions for rituals, recipes for medicines, observations of the stars and planets, mathematical tables, multiplication and division, square roots and cube roots, problems in geometry and algebra, stories, myths, legends, the great literary works that would later be recognized as the first written literature in human history. Among these texts, the myths held a special place. They were not mere entertainment, though they were certainly told and retold with pleasure. They were explanations, frameworks for understanding the nature of the world and the place of humanity within it. They answered the questions that every thinking person must ask at some point. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Why do we suffer and die? What is the right way to live? And what, if anything, lies beyond the horizon of mortal life? The longest and most complex of these myths were copied and recopied over centuries, each generation of scribes preserving the words of their predecessors with a care that bordered on reverence. One of the earliest and most influential was the story of creation, a narrative that described the beginning of all things in terms that the people of the land between the rivers could understand. In the beginning, the story said, there was only water, the mingling of Apsu, the sweet underground ocean, and Tiamat, the salt sea, the primordial mother. From their union came the first gods, younger beings full of energy and noise, and their commotion disturbed Apsu, who plotted to destroy them so that he could return to the silence and stillness he preferred. But the younger gods discovered the plot, and one of them, Enki, the wise and the cunning, cast a spell that put Apsu into a deep sleep, and while he slept, Enki killed him and claimed his domain. Tiamat, enraged by the death of her consort, raised an army of monsters and set out to avenge him. The younger gods were terrified and did not know what to do until one among them, Marduk, a god of storm and wind, offered to fight Tiamat on the condition that if he won, he would be made king of all the gods. The others agreed, and Marduk went forth to battle. The fight was terrible. Tiamat opened her jaws to swallow Marduk, but he sent a wind into her mouth that filled her belly and held her jaws apart, and then he shot an arrow into her heart and killed her. He split her body in two like a fish being gutted, and from one half he made the sky, and from the other half he made the earth. He set the stars in their courses, assigned the gods their domains and their duties, and then, as a final act, he created humanity from the blood of Tiamat's slain general, mixed with clay so that humans could serve the gods and free them from the burden of labour. This story was not just myth, it was theology, politics, cosmology, all woven together. It explained why the world had the shape it did, why the gods demanded service, why humans had to work, and it established a hierarchy, with Marduk at the top, a hierarchy that the kings of Babylon would later use to justify their own authority, claiming that just as Marduk ruled the gods, so the king ruled the people, by divine right and cosmic necessity. But there were other stories, older stories, stories that came from the Sumerian cities before Babylon rose to dominance. In these stories, the gods were more numerous and their relationships more fluid. There was no single king of heaven, or if there was, his authority was contested and conditional. Enki, whom the Babylonians would later call Ea, was one of the central figures in these older tales. He was the lord of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that lay beneath the earth and fed the rivers and springs. He was the god of wisdom and magic, of craftsmanship and creativity, the one who knew the me, the divine principles or decrees that governed all things, from kingship to music to sexual intercourse to writing itself. Enki was a trickster, a helper, a teacher. He gave humanity the arts of civilization, not out of obligation, but out of a kind of mischievous generosity. When the great flood was decreed by the other gods, who had grown tired of the noise and chaos of human life, it was Enki who whispered a warning to one man, telling him to build a boat and save himself and his family and the animals. When humanity needed grain, Enki brought it down from the mountains where the gods had hidden it. When humanity needed law, Enki inspired the first kings to write the codes that would regulate society. And yet, in some of the stories, there is a sense of distance, a sense that Enki and the other great gods were withdrawing, that the age of their direct intervention in human affairs was coming to an end. They had set the world in order, established the cities, given the knowledge and the tools, and now it was up to humanity to maintain what had been built. The gods would still be worshipped, still receive offerings, still send signs and omens, but they would not walk among humans as they once had. The boundary between the divine and the mortal was hardening, becoming less permeable, and certain things were being sealed away. This theme, the sealing, the closing, the withdrawal, appears in various forms across the literature. There are doors that must not be opened, thresholds that must not be crossed, knowledge that must not be spoken. In one text, Enki seals the Abzu, the underground ocean, making it his private domain, inaccessible to other gods and certainly to mortals. In another, the gods seal the gateway to the underworld, ensuring that the dead remain in their place and do not return to trouble the living. In yet another, a door is sealed in the sky, closing off the direct path between heaven and earth that had once allowed the gods to descend and humans, in rare cases, to ascend. The scribes who copied these texts understood them on multiple levels. On the surface, they were stories, dramatic and engaging, full of conflict and resolution. On a deeper level, they were expressions of a worldview, a way of making sense of the forces that shaped life and death, prosperity and disaster. And on the deepest level, perhaps, they were memories, distorted and mythologized, but rooted in something real, something that had changed in the relationship between the people and the powers they worshipped. In the cities of Sumer, the great cities that rose in the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, the temples grew larger and more elaborate. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, each one a centre of trade and craft and religious devotion, each one ruled by a king who claimed divine favour, and each one home to a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of mud brick that served as a bridge between earth and heaven. The ziggurats were massive constructions, rising in 3 or 4 or sometimes 7 levels, each level smaller than the one below, with a temple at the summit where the city's patron deity was believed to reside or at least to visit. The construction of a ziggurat was a communal effort that might take decades to complete. Workers hauled baskets of earth and brick up long ramps layer by layer, while overseers kept track of the quantities and the labour obligations. The outer faces were often decorated with coloured tiles or buttresses and recesses that created patterns of light and shadow. Staircases climbed the sides, leading to the upper levels where only priests were allowed to go. At the top, in the small temple chamber, an altar stood ready to receive offerings, and a bed was sometimes prepared, for it was believed that the god might descend during the night and rest there, and that a priestess might be chosen to attend the god in ways that the later texts describe only in veiled language. The people who lived in the shadow of these ziggurats went about their lives with a sense that the divine was near, that the gods watched and judged and intervened. When a child was born healthy, it was a blessing from Nintu, the mother goddess. When a man recovered from illness, it was because Ninisina, the goddess of healing, had heard his prayers. When a merchant returned safely from a long journey, it was thanks to the protection of Ninlil or Utu, the sun god who saw all things beneath his light. And when disaster struck, when the river flooded too high, or the harvest failed, or an enemy army appeared on the horizon, it was because the gods were angry or testing the people, or pursuing some purpose that mortals could not fully understand. The rituals that maintained the relationship between the human and the divine were elaborate and precise. Every day, the statue of the god in the temple had to be washed, dressed, and fed. The priest would enter the inner sanctuary at dawn, singing hymns as they approached, and they would remove the statue from its niche and carry it to a side chamber where water and linen cloths were waiting. The statue would be bathed, anointed with oil, dressed in fresh garments, and adorned with jewellery. Then it would be carried back to the main chamber and seated on its throne, and food would be laid before it, bread and beer and meat and fruit, while incense burned and musicians played. The god, of course, did not physically eat the food, but the essence of the food, its invisible nourishment, was believed to be consumed, and after a suitable interval, the physical food would be removed and distributed to the priests and temple workers as their daily rations. This was not considered leftovers or sacrilege. It was a sharing, a participation in the divine meal, a way of binding the human community to the god it served. On festival days, the rituals became even more elaborate. The statue might be carried out of the temple in procession, borne on a palanquin through the streets of the city while the people lined the route and sang and clapped and threw flowers. The procession would visit other temples, other gods, reinforcing the network of relationships among the divine powers. There would be sacrifices, animals slaughtered and their blood poured out on altars, their flesh roasted and distributed. There would be music and dancing, drums and lyres and flutes, voices raised in hymns that had been sung for generations. And there would be feasting, the whole city pausing in its work to celebrate and to remember that their prosperity, such as it was, depended on maintaining the goodwill of the gods. But even in the midst of these celebrations, there were moments of solemnity, moments when the prayers took on a darker tone. The people knew that the gods were powerful but not omnipotent, that they struggled among themselves, that their favour could not be taken for granted. And the people knew or sensed that the age of miracles was passing, that the gods were not as present as they had once been, that the stories told by the grandparents of grandparents spoke of a time when the divine and the human had been closer, and that time was receding like the floodwaters after the spring surge, leaving behind only traces and memories. In the scribe schools, the students copied a text called the Sumerian King List, a document that purported to record the names and reigns of every king who had ruled in Sumer from the very beginning. The list began with the phrase, "when kingship was lowered from heaven," and it described kings who reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, in the cities before the flood. Then came the flood, a single line in the text, and after the flood the reigns became shorter, more human, though still exaggerated by any reasonable standard. And as the list moved forward in time, the reigns continued to shorten, approaching the lifespans that actual human beings might live, and the tone of the text shifted from myth to something that resembled history, a chronicle of real kings whose deeds could be verified, more or less, by other documents and monuments. The message was clear, if unstated. There had been a time when the world was different, when the gods had ruled directly or through intermediaries who partook of divine nature. But that time was over, and now the world was the world of men, and the gods, though still worshipped and still powerful, had withdrawn to their own realm, leaving humanity to manage its own affairs with whatever wisdom and strength it could muster. The scribes also copied another type of text, less well known but no less important. These were the ritual instructions, the handbooks that told the priests exactly what to do and when and how. Some of these texts were mundane, simple lists of offerings and prayers, but others were strange, cryptic, filled with references to objects and actions whose purpose was not entirely clear. There were instructions for opening certain doors in the temple at certain times of the year and for sealing them again. There were warnings about thresholds that should not be crossed, about chambers that should remain locked, about knowledge that should be kept only among the highest ranks of the priesthood. One fragment, recovered from the ruins of a temple library in the city of Nippur, described a door in the deepest level of the temple, a door that had been sealed in the time of the ancestors and was not to be opened. The text did not say what lay beyond the door, only that it had been closed by the command of the Anunnaki, the great gods, before they withdrew from their regular presence in the temple. The fragment was damaged, the clay broken, and parts of the text missing, but the surviving lines spoke of a threshold between the world of the living and something else, a boundary that had been established to protect both sides, to keep what belonged in one realm from spilling into the other. The word Anunnaki appears frequently in the cuneiform texts, and its meaning shifted over time and across regions. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki seem to have been a collective term for the great gods, the senior deities who made the important decisions and held authority over the lesser gods and over humanity. In later Babylonian texts, the term sometimes referred specifically to the gods of the underworld, the judges of the dead, as distinct from the Igigi, the gods of heaven. But in all cases, the Anunnaki were beings of immense power, beings who had shaped the world and who continued to influence it, even if their presence was no longer as direct as it had once been. The myths describe the Anunnaki gathering an assembly to make decisions, much like a council of elders in a human city. They debated, they voted, they issued decrees, and one of those decrees, according to some of the later commentaries and fragmentary texts, was the decision to seal certain gateways, to close off certain paths, to ensure that the boundary between the divine and the mortal, between the upper world and the lower world, would remain secure. The reasons for this decision were not spelled out, or if they were, the texts have not survived, but the decision itself, the act of sealing, was remembered. The tablets that have survived from the ancient world are only a fraction of what was once written. For every clay document that endured, baked hard by fire or by the sun, or by the accidental burning of the building that housed it, there were dozens or hundreds that crumbled back into dust, dissolved in rain, or were simply thrown away when their information was no longer needed. The scribes knew this. They knew that clay was fragile, that libraries could burn, that cities could fall, and so the most important texts were copied and recopied, generation after generation, each new scribe adding his name to the colophon at the end, the small note that said who had written the tablet, when, and from what source. The colophons are precious to modern scholars because they reveal the chains of transmission, the way knowledge passed from one scribe to another across centuries. A tablet from the 7th century before the Common Era might note that it was copied from a tablet in the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, which was itself copied from an earlier tablet found in the ruins of Babylon, which in turn was a copy of a Sumerian original from the city of Nippur, written 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal was born. The scribes understood that they were links in a long chain, preserving something older than themselves, something that mattered. Among the texts they preserved were the great literary works, the poems and epics that would later be recognized as the foundation of written narrative. The most famous of these, known to the modern world as the Epic of Gilgamesh, was composed in its earliest form in Sumerian, probably in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and then translated and expanded in Akkadian, the Semitic language that became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia after the rise of the Akkadian Empire. The story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk who sought immortality and failed to find it, touched on themes that resonated across cultures and centuries: the fear of death, the desire for lasting fame, the limits of human power, the importance of friendship, the inevitability of loss. But Gilgamesh was not the only hero whose story was told on clay. There were poems about Enmerkar, another king of Uruk, who waged a war of words and wits against the lord of Arata, a distant city in the mountains. There were stories of Lugalbanda, who travelled through strange lands and received blessings from the gods. There were hymns to kings and queens, praising their justice, their strength, their piety, their beauty. And there were laments, long, mournful poems that described the destruction of cities, the toppling of temples, the scattering of populations, the silence that followed catastrophe. The laments were composed in the aftermath of real disasters, invasions and conquest that left cities in ruins. One of the most poignant is the Lament for Ur, a poem that describes the fall of the great city of Ur to invading forces from the east, the Elamites, around the end of the 3rd millennium. The poem does not focus on military details. It focuses on the suffering of the people, the weeping of the goddess Ningal, the patron deity of Ur, who watches helplessly as her city is destroyed, her temple burned, her people killed or driven into exile. The goddess pleads with the other gods to spare the city, but the decision has already been made, the decree has been issued, and even a goddess cannot overturn the will of the assembly of the Anunnaki. The lament describes the sealing of the city's fate in language that echoes other texts about sealing and closure. The gods have turned their faces away, the gates of heaven are closed, the city is cut off from divine protection, left to its doom. And after the destruction, the survivors return to find the streets empty, the houses collapsed, the fields overgrown, and they sing their sorrow in verses that were copied and recited for centuries afterward, not just as memorial, but as a kind of ritual healing, a way of naming the pain so that it could be borne. The idea of sealing, of closing, of cutting off access, runs through the literature like a dark thread. It appears in the myths of the underworld, that shadowy realm beneath the earth where the dead were believed to go. The underworld was called Kur in Sumerian, or sometimes Erkala in Akkadian, and it was described as a place of dust and darkness, where the dead lived as pale shadows of their former selves, eating clay and drinking stagnant water, dressed in feathered garments like birds. It was not a place of punishment, not in the way that later religious traditions would imagine hell, but it was not a place of reward either. It was simply the destination of all who died, noble and commoner, king and slave, righteous and wicked alike. The entrance to the underworld was a gate, or rather a series of 7 gates, each one guarded by a watchman who demanded that the traveller remove some piece of clothing or adornment before passing through. By the time a soul reached the throne room of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, it was stripped bare, powerless, utterly at her mercy. The gates were sealed behind each traveller, ensuring that there was no easy return. The living could not enter except in the most extraordinary circumstances, and the dead could not leave except by the will of the gods. The most famous story of a journey to the underworld is the Descent of Inanna, a Sumerian poem that describes how the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven, decided to visit her sister Ereshkigal in the land of the dead. Inanna dressed herself in all her finest regalia, her crown and her jewels and her royal robe, and she descended through the 7 gates, and at each gate she was forced to remove one item until she stood naked and powerless before her sister. Ereshkigal, angry at the intrusion, struck Inanna dead with a glance, and the goddess's corpse was hung on a hook like a piece of meat. But Inanna had prepared for this possibility. Before descending, she had instructed her servant to raise an alarm if she did not return within 3 days, and when the alarm was raised, the god Enki intervened. He created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures that were neither male nor female, neither living nor dead, and he sent them to the underworld with the food and water of life. They entered the realm of Ereshkigal, flattered her, sympathized with her pain, for she was in the throes of labor, giving birth to something the text does not name, and in gratitude she offered them a gift. They asked for the corpse of Inanna, and she gave it, and they sprinkled it with the food and water of life, and Inanna rose. But the laws of the underworld were strict. No one who entered could leave without providing a substitute, someone to take their place. Inanna returned to the world of the living accompanied by demons who would seize the first person who failed to show proper mourning for her death. She found her consort, the shepherd god Dumuzi, sitting on a throne and dressed in fine garments, showing no sign of grief, and in her rage she pointed at him, and the demons dragged him down to the underworld to take her place. The story ends with a compromise. Dumuzi and his sister Geshtinanna would each spend half the year in the underworld, alternating, so that neither would be trapped there forever, and this alternation was said to correspond to the cycle of the seasons, the dry season when the vegetation dies, and the wet season when it returns, a mythic explanation for the rhythms of the natural world. But beyond the narrative, the poem is also about boundaries, about the gates that separate one realm from another, about the cost of crossing those gates and the necessity of sealing them again. The underworld must remain sealed, except for those moments when the gods decree otherwise. Because if the boundary were to fail, if the dead were to rise and walk among the living, the order of the cosmos would collapse. This fear, or this understanding, appears in other texts as well. There are incantations designed to keep ghosts from returning to trouble the living, rituals to seal the tombs of the dead, prayers that ask the gods to maintain the boundaries that keep the world separate. And there are hints in some of the fragmentary texts that the gods themselves were concerned with this task, that one of the responsibilities of the Anunnaki was to guard the thresholds, to keep the doors sealed that needed to remain sealed. One such text, recovered from the ruins of a temple in the city of Uruk, describes a ritual performed once every generation by the high priest and a select group of initiates. The ritual involved descending into the deepest chamber of the temple, a chamber that was normally kept locked, and checking the seal on a door that was said to lead to a passage connecting the temple to the Abzu, the underground ocean where Enki dwelt. The seal was a physical object, a clay plug or a bronze lock, but it was also a magical seal, reinforced by incantations and by the authority of the gods who had first placed it. The text describes the priest approaching the door with a lamp, examining the seal to ensure it had not been disturbed, and then reciting a prayer of thanks to the Anunnaki for their protection. The prayer acknowledges that the door was sealed in a time before human memory, sealed by the gods themselves before they withdrew their presence from the daily affairs of the temple, and that it must remain sealed until the gods return or until the end of days, whichever comes first. The priest then exits the chamber, locks the outer door, and records the completion of the ritual in the temple archives, so that the next generation will know when the ritual is due to be performed again. The text is matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic in tone, but the implications are profound. It suggests that the people of that time believed, or at least their religious authorities taught, that there were physical locations where the boundary between the human world and the divine world, or the human world and some other world, was thin, and that these locations had been secured by the gods in an earlier age. The sealing was not metaphorical. It was real, or at least it was treated as real, with all the seriousness that such a responsibility demanded. Another fragment, this one from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, mentions a door in the mountains to the north, beyond the headwaters of the Tigris, where the Anunnaki had descended from the sky in the time before the flood, and where they had sealed the entrance behind them when they departed. The text is frustratingly incomplete, broken off just as it begins to describe the location in more detail, but the surviving lines speak of a stone threshold carved with signs that no living scribe could read, signs that predated the invention of cuneiform, signs that were said to glow faintly in the dark and to hum when the wind blew across them in a certain way. The text notes that travellers who ventured into those mountains sometimes reported finding the place, though their descriptions varied and none could agree on exactly where it was or how to reach it reliably. Some said it was a cave mouth, blocked by a great stone. Others said it was a cleft in the rock face, too narrow for a human to enter, sealed with a substance that looked like glass but could not be broken. Still others said it was not a physical door at all, but a distortion in the air, a shimmer like heat haze, and that anyone who stepped into the shimmer would vanish and never return. The text treats these reports with a kind of scholarly caution, neither endorsing them fully nor dismissing them outright. It notes that the high priests of several temples had sent expeditions to search for the door, hoping to confirm its existence and perhaps to learn something from it, but none of the expeditions had succeeded in bringing back definitive proof. The text concludes with a reflection that some knowledge is meant to remain hidden, that the gods in their wisdom have sealed certain things away, and that humans should be content with the knowledge they have been given, and not seek to overturn the divine order. This attitude, this acceptance of limits, was central to the worldview expressed in much of the cuneiform literature. Humanity had been created to serve the gods, to maintain the temples, to perform the rituals, to keep the world running smoothly so that the gods could rest. In return, the gods provided protection, guidance, and the blessings of fertility and prosperity. But there were boundaries that should not be crossed, knowledge that should not be sought, powers that should not be claimed. The story of the flood, in all its various versions, was in part a warning about what happened when humanity overstepped those boundaries, when the noise and the chaos and the ambition of human life became too great and the gods decided to wipe the slate clean. Yet there was also a tradition, quieter and less prominent, that celebrated human curiosity and ingenuity, that honoured those who pushed the boundaries and brought back new knowledge. Enki was often portrayed as the patron of this tradition, the god who gave humanity the arts and crafts, who taught the secrets of magic and medicine, who defied the other gods to save humanity from the flood. In some stories, Enki is almost a rebel, a trickster who works around the decrees of the divine assembly to help the humans he has created and to whom he seems to feel a certain affection. This tension between obedience and curiosity, between accepting the limits set by the gods and seeking to transcend them, runs through many of the myths and finds its fullest expression in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, the hero of the story, is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a king of extraordinary strength and vitality who cannot accept the reality of death. When his beloved friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is shattered, and he sets out on a journey to find immortality, to escape the fate that awaits all mortals. His journey takes him to the edges of the known world, through dark tunnels and across waters of death, until he finally meets Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim to share the secret of immortality, but Utnapishtim tells him that the opportunity has passed, that the gods granted him eternal life as a unique reward and will not do so again. He offers Gilgamesh a test: stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, and if you can do that, perhaps you will prove yourself worthy. But Gilgamesh, exhausted from his journey, falls asleep almost immediately, and when he wakes, he realizes he has failed. Utnapishtim takes pity on him and reveals the location of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth, if not grant true immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, and begins the journey home, thinking he will share the plant with the elders of Uruk and make his city a place where age can be reversed. But on the way he stops to bathe in a pool, and a snake smells the plant and steals it, eating it and shedding its skin, gaining the power of renewal that Gilgamesh had sought. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, and the epic ends with him walking the walls of his city, contemplating the works he has built, the great walls and temples that will outlast his mortal body. The message is clear: immortality is not for humans, but legacy is. The works of our hands, the stories we tell, the communities we build, these are what survive. The epic does not describe any sealed door, at least not in the versions that have survived, but it touches on the same theme of boundaries that cannot be crossed, of divine decisions that cannot be overturned, of the separation between mortal and immortal that defines the human condition. Gilgamesh seeks to cross that boundary and fails, not because he lacks courage or strength, but because the boundary is real and has been established by powers greater than any individual. The scribes who copied the Epic of Gilgamesh also copied other texts that explored similar themes in different registers. There were wisdom texts, collections of proverbs and advice that counselled moderation, humility, respect for the gods, and for the social order. There were omen texts, long catalogues that correlated celestial events, or the appearance of animal livers with future outcomes, a form of divination that assumed the gods communicated their intentions through signs that the trained observer could read. And there were ritual texts, as we've mentioned, that provided instructions for maintaining the temples and the boundaries they represented. In the city of Eridu, which the Sumerians believed to be the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship was lowered from heaven, there was a temple dedicated to Enki that was said to stand directly above the Abzu, the freshwater abyss. The temple was rebuilt many times over the millennia, each new structure built on the ruins of the old, and the foundations went deep, layer upon layer of mud, brick and rubble descending into the earth. Archaeologists who excavated the site in the 20th century found evidence of continuous occupation going back to the 6th millennium before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest religious sites in Mesopotamia. The later myths describe the temple at Eridu as the point of connection between the surface world and the realm of Enki, and they describe rituals performed there that involved lowering offerings into a well or a shaft, gifts sent down into the depths for the god who dwelt below. Some texts hint that the shaft was more than symbolic, that it was a literal passage, and that in the earliest days, priests would descend into the depths to consult with Enki directly. But at some point, according to these texts, the passage was sealed, closed off by Enki himself, who withdrew into the Abzu and decreed that communication would henceforth be mediated through dreams and omens rather than through direct encounter. The reasons for this withdrawal are not stated, or if they were, the texts have not survived in sufficient detail. But the pattern is consistent across multiple sources. There was a time of closeness, and then a time of distancing, and the transition between the two was marked by the sealing of doors, the closing of passages, the establishment of boundaries that had not existed before or had been more permeable. The turning point in the modern understanding of these ancient stories came not from a grand discovery in a royal palace or a famous city, but from the patient, painstaking work of scholars who spent decades learning to read a script that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. The cuneiform tablets had been noticed by European travellers as early as the 17th century, fragments of baked clay covered in strange wedge-shaped marks, but no one knew what they said or even what language they represented. The tablets were curiosities, collected by diplomats and adventurers, displayed in cabinets alongside other exotic objects from distant lands, but their voices remained locked inside the clay. The breakthrough began in the early 19th century with the decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform, a relatively simple script used by the Achaemenid kings of Persia. Scholars working with inscriptions carved into cliff faces in Iran, most notably the great trilingual inscription at Behistun commissioned by Darius the Great, were able to puzzle out the phonetic values of the signs by comparing the Persian text with known royal names and titles. This gave them a foothold, and from there they moved to the more complex scripts used for Babylonian and Assyrian, the Akkadian language, and eventually to the even older Sumerian. The process was slow and filled with false starts and competing theories, but by the middle of the 19th century, a small community of scholars in Europe and America had gained the ability to read the tablets with increasing confidence. Libraries that had been silent for millennia began to speak again. The Epic of Gilgamesh was rediscovered, the creation myths were translated, the legal codes and business contracts and school exercises and prayers all emerged into the light of modern understanding. And among the thousands upon thousands of texts that were gradually catalogued and studied, there were fragments and references that caught the attention of those who were looking for patterns, for recurring themes, for the deep structure of the mythological imagination. One such scholar, working in the British Museum in the early 20th century, noticed a reference in a damaged tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal to a door sealed by the Anunnaki before their departure from the human realm. The tablet was part of a larger ritual text, and the reference was brief, almost incidental, but it echoed other passages the scholar had seen in other texts, and he began to compile a list of these references, tracing the theme through the available literature. The work was difficult because the tablets were fragmentary, their surfaces worn or broken, and because the texts themselves were often elusive, assuming knowledge on the part of the reader that modern scholars did not possess. A phrase that would have been immediately understood by an ancient scribe might be opaque to a modern translator, and the context that would clarify the meaning might be lost in the missing portions of the tablet. But slowly, through comparison and cross-reference and educated guesswork, a picture began to emerge. The tablet that would later be called, informally, the Sealed Door Tablet, was catalogued as part of a collection acquired by the British Museum in the late 19th century. It had been excavated from the ruins of a building in the ancient city of Sippar, a city on the Euphrates north of Babylon, known in antiquity as a centre of sun worship and of scribal learning. The tablet was small, roughly the size of a hand, and it was broken along one edge, with several lines of text missing from the beginning and the end. What survived was a description, written in Akkadian, of a ritual to be performed in the temple of Shamash, the sun god, at the turning of the year. The ritual involved the high priest and 2 assistants descending into a chamber beneath the temple, a chamber that is described as being very old, older than the current structure of the temple, perhaps a remnant of an earlier building on the same site. In this chamber, according to the text, there was a door set into the western wall, a door made of cedar wood reinforced with bronze, and the door was sealed with a clay plug impressed with the symbols of the Anunnaki, the 7 stars or the 7 tablets or the 7 words of power. The text is unclear on this point because the relevant line is damaged. The priest is instructed to approach the door with a lamp and with incense, and to recite a prayer acknowledging the authority of the Anunnaki, and affirming that the seal remains intact. The prayer includes a phrase that can be translated roughly as the door that was closed when the Great Ones withdrew, or possibly the door that was closed before the Great Ones departed. The grammar allows for both interpretations. The priest then makes an offering of oil and bread, placing it on a small altar or ledge near the door, and recites another prayer asking for the protection and favour of the gods in the year to come. The text emphasises that the door must not be opened, that the seal must not be broken, and that any priest who violates this instruction will bring calamity upon the city and upon himself. The consequences are not specified in detail, but the language is severe, invoking the wrath of the Anunnaki and the dissolution of the boundary between the ordered world and the chaos that lies beyond. The ritual concludes with the priest and his assistants withdrawing from the chamber, locking the outer door behind them, and recording the completion of the ritual in the temple records. The tablet itself is dated based on the style of the script and the historical references in the colophon to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the great king of Babylon who ruled in the 6th century before the Common Era, and who is remembered both for his military conquests and for his ambitious building projects, including the reconstruction of the temples of Babylon and the creation of the famous Hanging Gardens, if those gardens were indeed real and not a later legend. The colophon notes that the tablet was copied from an older tablet in the temple archives, and that the older tablet was itself a copy of a text from the time of Hammurabi, the lawgiver, who reigned 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar. This chain of copying suggests that the ritual, and the door it describes, were part of a continuous tradition that stretched back into the deep past, maintained and transmitted by the scribble schools and the priesthoods, even as cities rose and fell, empires came and went, and the language itself evolved from Sumerian to Akkadian, and eventually to Aramaic. The ritual was important enough to be preserved, copied, and performed, generation after generation, which implies that the door, or the idea of the door, held a significance that went beyond the merely symbolic. But what did the door represent, and what lay beyond it? The text does not say, at least not in the portions that have survived. Scholars have proposed various interpretations. Some have suggested that the door was a metaphor for the boundary between the sacred and the profane, and that the ritual was a way of reinforcing the holiness of the inner sanctuary of the temple. Others have proposed that the door represented the boundary between life and death, and that the chamber was in some sense an entrance to the underworld, a liminal space that had to be carefully managed to prevent the dead from returning or the living from descending prematurely. Still, others have taken the text more literally, suggesting that the ancient Mesopotamians believed in the existence of physical portals connecting different realms or dimensions, and that these portals had been sealed by the gods to prevent unauthorized passage. This interpretation is more speculative, less grounded in the mainstream of academic scholarship, but it resonates with certain themes in the mythology, particularly the emphasis on thresholds and boundaries and the idea that the cosmos is structured in layers, with the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the underworld below, and with connections between these layers that must be regulated and controlled. The phrase, "before they left," or "when they withdrew," is particularly intriguing. It suggests a narrative in which the Anunnaki, having been present and active in the human world, made a decision to depart, and before departing, they took steps to secure certain thresholds to prevent the kind of uncontrolled interaction that had characterized the earlier age. This withdrawal is not described as a sudden event but as a process, something that unfolded over time, and the sealing of the door is presented as part of that process, a final act of boundary setting before the gods stepped back from their direct involvement in human affairs. This narrative, if it can be called that, fits with the broader pattern we see in the Mesopotamian literature. The earliest myths describe a world in which gods and humans live in close proximity, almost intermingled. The gods build cities, dig canals, grow tired of the work, and create humans to take over the labour. Humans and gods interact directly, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting. But over time, the distance grows. The gods withdraw to the heavens or to the depths, or to remote sacred spaces, and humans are left to manage the world on their own, guided by the rituals and the laws that the gods have established. The flood story, in its various versions, can be read as the pivotal moment in this transition. Before the flood, the text of Atrahasis tells us, the noise of humanity had become unbearable to the gods, particularly to Enlil, and the gods decided to destroy humanity entirely. But Enki, as we have noted, intervened to save one man and his family, and after the flood, the gods restructured the relationship, imposing limits on human population and lifespan, establishing the institutions of priesthood and kingship, and withdrawing to a greater distance. The flood marks the end of the age of gods and the beginning of the age of men, or at least the beginning of the transition between the two. The sealing of the door in this context is both practical and symbolic. Practically, it prevents the kind of direct access that had existed before, the ability of gods to descend freely into the human world, or of humans, in rare cases, to ascend into the divine. Symbolically, it represents the acceptance of limits, the recognition that the two realms are separate, and that the boundary between them must be maintained for the sake of cosmic order. Archaeologists who have worked in Mesopotamia have sometimes reported finding physical evidence that might correspond to the descriptions in the ritual texts. In the ruins of several temples, including the Temple of Shamash at Sippar and the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, excavators have uncovered subterranean chambers, rooms carved into the bedrock or built below the level of the temple floor, accessed by narrow staircases or shafts. These chambers are often small, and they typically contain altars or offering tables and sometimes fragments of inscriptions, though few have survived intact enough to provide clear information about their purpose. In one case, in a temple at the site of ancient Uruk, excavators found a chamber with a doorway that had been deliberately sealed with mud brick, the bricks carefully fitted to match the surrounding wall so that the doorway was almost invisible. When the seal was removed and the chamber opened, it was found to be empty except for a layer of fine dust and a single broken oil lamp lying on the floor. There were no inscriptions, no offerings, no indication of what the chamber had been used for or why it had been sealed. The excavators speculated that it might have been a storage room, or a tomb, or a ritual space that had been abandoned for some reason and then closed off, but the lack of evidence left the question unresolved. Another excavation, this one at the site of Eridu, uncovered a deep shaft descending from the floor of the temple, lined with baked bricks and capped with a stone slab. The shaft was too narrow for a person to descend, but it appeared to have been used for lowering offerings into the depths, perhaps into the water table or into a natural cavity below. The shaft had been sealed at some point in antiquity, the stone slab cemented in place with bitumen, and it remained sealed until the modern excavators opened it. Inside, the shaft was empty, filled only with sand and debris that had sifted down over the centuries. These physical findings do not prove the existence of a sealed door in the sense described by the ritual texts, but they do show that the ancient Mesopotamians built structures designed to manage the boundary between the accessible and the inaccessible, the known and the hidden. They invested considerable effort in creating, maintaining, and eventually sealing certain spaces within their temples, and they accompanied this physical work with ritual and text, ensuring that the meaning and the memory of the space would be preserved even if the space itself was no longer in active use. The question of what the ancient people themselves believed is more difficult to answer. Did the priests who performed the ritual at the sealed door believe that there was literally a passage to another realm beyond it? Or did they understand the door as a symbol, a representation of a theological or cosmological principle? The texts do not provide a clear answer, and it is possible that different individuals held different beliefs, or that the belief evolved over time as the memory of the door's origin faded and the ritual became more formalized. What is clear is that the ritual mattered, that it was performed with care and recorded with precision, and that the idea of the sealed door resonated deeply enough to be preserved in the literary and ritual traditions for more than 1,000 years. The door, whether literal or symbolic, stood for something important. The boundary between the age of the gods and the age of men, the threshold that must not be crossed, the knowledge that must not be sought, the order that must be maintained even at the cost of curiosity and ambition. In the daily life of the cities where these rituals were performed, most people would have known little or nothing about the sealed door in the depths of the temple. Their interaction with the divine was mediated through the public rituals, the festivals and processions, the prayers and offerings made in the outer courtyards where lay people were allowed to enter, the inner sanctuaries, the chambers where the god statue resided and where the high priests performed the most sacred rites, were off limits to all but a select few, and the deeper chambers, the ones that descended into the earth, were even more restricted. But the people knew, in a general way, that the temple was a threshold, a place where the human and the divine came close, and they knew that the priests who served in the temple were guardians of that threshold, responsible for maintaining the rituals that kept the relationship balanced and the boundaries secure. They knew that the gods had once been more present and that they had withdrawn, and they knew that the withdrawal was not abandonment but a different kind of relationship, one that required human effort and human faithfulness to sustain. The seasonal festivals were the times when this relationship was most visibly enacted. During the New Year festival, for example, which was celebrated in Babylon with great ceremony, the statue of Marduk would be carried out of his temple in procession, and the king would participate in rituals that symbolically reenacted the creation of the world and the establishment of order over chaos. The festival lasted several days, and it included dramas, sacrifices, feasting, and the public reading of the creation epic, the Enuma Elish, so that the people would remember the story of how Marduk defeated Tiamat and became king of the gods. The king, during the festival, would enter the temple and be ritually humiliated by the high priest, who would strip him of his royal regalia and strike him on the cheek, forcing him to kneel and declare his innocence of wrongdoing. This was a way of reinforcing the idea that the king ruled not by his own power, but by the favour of the gods, and that his authority was conditional on his faithfulness to the divine order. After the humiliation, the regalia would be returned, and the king would be symbolically recrowned, renewed for another year of rule. These public rituals were powerful and moving, and they created a sense of participation in something larger than any individual life. But beneath the public rituals, in the depths of the temple, other rituals were being performed, rituals that only the priests knew, rituals like the one described in the sealed door tablet, rituals that maintained the hidden structure of the cosmos, the boundaries and thresholds that most people would never see but on which, according to the belief, the stability of the world depended. To understand what life looked like at the height of Mesopotamian civilization, at those centuries when the cities of Babylon and Nineveh and Uruk and Nippur were thriving centers of human activity, one must set aside the grand narrative of kings and wars and divine decrees and descend into the texture of ordinary days. History lives not only in the throne rooms and the temple sanctuaries, but in the kitchens and the marketplaces, in the workshops where craftsmen bent over their work by lamplight, in the schoolrooms where children pressed their first tentative wedges into soft clay, in the fields where families spent the greater part of their waking hours keeping the land productive and the canals clear. Picture, if you will, a morning in the city of Babylon during the reign of one of the great kings, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era, when the city was at or near the peak of its power and its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The sun has not yet risen, but the sky to the east is beginning to pale, shifting from deep black to a bruised blue-grey, and the air is cool and carries the smell of the river, that particular damp earth smell that anyone who has lived near a large body of moving water will recognize, a smell compounded of silt and fish and the faint sweetness of water plants. The city wakes slowly. The first sounds are the animals, the lowing of cattle in their pens near the city walls, the bleating of goats, the clucking of chickens, and the deeper, more deliberate sounds of the river itself, the slap of water against wooden boat hulls, the creak of mooring ropes. Then the human sounds begin. A baby crying, a door being unbarred, the rhythmic thump of someone beginning to grind grain in a stone quern, working it back and forth with a steady persistence that will continue for the better part of an hour until enough flour has been produced for the day's bread. The houses of ordinary Babylonians were built of mud brick, like virtually every structure in the land, because wood was scarce and stone was almost non-existent in the flat alluvial plain. The bricks were made from the abundant river clay, mixed with chopped straw or reed fibre to improve their strength, pressed into wooden moulds and left to dry in the sun. A skilled brickmaker could produce hundreds of bricks in a day, working in the early morning before the heat became oppressive. The bricks were stacked without mortar, or with a thin layer of mud mortar to form walls that could be quite thick, 1/2 metre or more in the better houses, which helped to keep the interior cool during the brutal summer months. The typical house was built around a central courtyard, open to the sky, which served as the main living space for much of the year. Rooms opened off the courtyard on all 4 sides, providing sleeping spaces, storage, and a kitchen area with a clay oven and a grinding stone. The floors were beaten earth, sometimes coated with a layer of gypsum plaster that could be swept clean, and the walls were plastered with a smooth finish of mud and lime that reflected the light. There were no windows to the street for privacy and security, and the entrance was a narrow doorway set in the outer wall, fitted with a wooden door hung on stone pivot sockets. The household would have consisted of an extended family, perhaps a man and his wife, their children, an elderly parent or two, a servant or a slave who shared the same living space, and perhaps a brother's family occupying a separate portion of the same building. In the wealthier households, there might be multiple servants, a formal reception room near the entrance for greeting guests, and a small shrine in the courtyard where the household's personal deity, the protective spirit that watched over the family, could be venerated with daily offerings of bread, oil, and beer. The water for the household came from the canals or from shared wells in the neighbourhood, carried in clay jars on the heads of women and children, a task performed several times a day. The canals were maintained by the city administration, which assigned labour obligations to households based on their size and resources. Every year, before the planting season, crews of workers would clear the accumulated silt from the canal beds and repair the embankments, working under the supervision of overseers who kept track of the labour performed and the labour still owed. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential, and the prosperity of the whole city depended on it being done diligently. The market of a great Babylonian city was a place of extraordinary variety and vitality. It was held along the main streets near the river quays, where boats arrived daily from up and down the Euphrates carrying goods from dozens of different places. From the north came timber, the cedar of Lebanon, and the pine of the Zagros Mountains, precious materials in a land that grew almost no trees of its own. From the east came metals, copper and tin and the iron that was gradually becoming more common, along with lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that Mesopotamians prized above almost all other materials for its colour, its rarity, and its association with the divine. From the south came dates and fish, dried and salted for preservation, and from the fertile fields around the city came grain, the endless barley and emmer wheat that was the foundation of the economy. The market also offered spices and aromatics, cinnamon and cardamom and frankincense brought by long-distance traders who had travelled from Arabia or from India, carrying their goods on the backs of donkeys or camels through weeks of difficult terrain. There were textiles too, wool and linen in plain weaves and in complex patterns, the product of the many hundreds of women who worked in the great textile workshops of the city, and of the smaller household looms that hummed in the courtyards. The prices of goods were set partly by negotiation and partly by convention, with certain ratios between commodities remaining fairly stable over long periods. The basic unit of account was silver, in the form of small weighed pieces rather than coins, for coinage would not arrive in Mesopotamia until much later, borrowed from the Greek world. A transaction would be negotiated, the weight of silver agreed upon, and the silver weighed out on a balance scale, with the weights themselves checked against the official standards kept at the temple. The scribes who worked in the market, and they were numerous, would then draw up a contract on a small clay tablet, recording the names of the parties, the goods exchanged, the price agreed, the witnesses present, and the date, and the tablet would be sealed with the cylinder seal of each party and left to dry. Cylinder seals were one of the most elegant inventions of the Mesopotamian world. Small stone cylinders engraved with intricate designs, animals and gods and mythological scenes and geometric patterns that could be rolled across soft clay to leave a continuous impression. Every person of any standing had a cylinder seal, and it served as a personal identifier, the equivalent of a signature or a fingerprint. The seals were made from a variety of materials, from the common limestone or marble to the precious lapis lazuli and carnelian, and they were worn as pendants around the neck, suspended from a cord, so that they were always at hand when needed. The engraving of cylinder seals was a specialized craft requiring both artistic skill and the ability to work in miniature, carving the design in reverse so that the impression would appear correctly oriented. The craftsmen who made the finest seals were highly valued, and their products were collected and treasured not just for their practical utility but for their beauty. Some seals depicted mythological scenes with extraordinary detail, showing the gods in their various aspects, the hero wrestling with animals, the suppliant approaching the enthroned deity, the ritual processions and the divine assemblies. Looking at these small objects, it is possible to see the mythology made visual, the same stories told on the tablets expressed in compressed and elegant form. The temples dominated the skyline of every Mesopotamian city, rising above the flat rooftops of the domestic quarters in stepped profiles that were visible from a great distance across the flat plain. The ziggurat, the great step tower, was the most prominent feature, but around its base clustered a complex of subsidiary buildings: the temple of the god, the storerooms and workshops, the residences of the priests, the school where the scribes were trained, the kitchens where the divine meals were prepared, and the slaughterhouse where the sacrificial animals were killed. The whole complex was enclosed by a high, mud brick wall with a single ceremonial gate, and it functioned almost as a city within a city, with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own rules and rhythms. The priesthood was a large and complex institution. At the top was the high priest or high priestess, the chief mediator between the human and the divine, who performed the most important rituals and held authority over all the temple's affairs. Below them were various ranks of priests, each with specific duties: the ones who sang the hymns, the ones who performed the purifications, the ones who interpreted the omens, the ones who oversaw the sacrifices, the ones who managed the storerooms, the ones who supervised the workers. There were also the lamentation priests, specialists in the mourning rituals that accompanied death and disaster, who could recite from memory long texts of lament and prayer, and who were consulted when the community needed to express its sorrow to the gods. Women played a significant role in the religious life of the temples, though the nature and extent of that role varied by city, by period, and by the particular deity being served. Some temples had high priestesses who held authority equal to or greater than their male counterparts. The most famous of these was the position known as the priestess, a woman of royal lineage who served as the earthly consort of the moon god Nana at Ur, a position that was of enormous religious and political importance, and that was held at various periods by daughters of the most powerful kings. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, held this position and is known to history as the first named author, a woman who composed hymns of extraordinary beauty and complexity that survived in the scribble tradition for centuries after her death. The hymns of Enheduanna are remarkable not only for their literary quality, but for the personal voice that speaks through them. She addresses the goddess Inanna directly, with a familiarity and an intensity that feels startlingly modern, praising her power, lamenting her own suffering and exile, and appealing for divine intervention in her personal and political difficulties. The hymns were copied and studied in the scribal schools long after Enheduanna herself was dead, used as models of literary style and as examples of the proper forms of address to the deity, and in this way her voice continued to be heard and her name continued to be known. This practice of personal prayer, of addressing the deity directly and speaking from one's own experience, was not limited to the priesthood. The ordinary people of Babylon and Nippur and Ur had their own religious lives, their own practices of prayer and offering and consultation, conducted partly in the outer courts of the great temples and partly in the domestic shrines of their own homes. They prayed for health and for children, for success in business and in love, for protection from demons and from the envy of neighbours, for good harvests and safe journeys. They made small clay figurines and placed them in the shrines, models of the supplicant standing with hands clasped in the attitude of prayer, a permanent representative left before the deity when the worshipper could not be present. They also consulted diviners, specialists who could interpret the signs that the gods sent through the natural world. The most common form of divination was extispicy, the reading of the livers and other internal organs of sacrificed animals. The liver was considered the seat of life and the mirror of the divine will, and a trained diviner could examine its shape and colour and the arrangement of its features, comparing them with the models and the text collections that described what each variation meant. There were clay models of livers, made for use in training, marked with regions and labelled with the predictions associated with each. A blemish in one part of the liver might mean victory in battle, while the same blemish in another part might mean the death of the king. Dreams were another vehicle of divine communication, and the interpretation of dreams was a specialised art with its own handbooks and its own practitioners. A dream in which the dreamer saw a particular animal, or found themselves in a particular place, or performed a particular action, could be interpreted according to established conventions, with the interpretation adjusted for the identity and circumstances of the dreamer. Important dreams were recorded in writing and sent to the palace or the temple for official interpretation, and a large corpus of dream omens has survived in the cuneiform record, cataloguing hundreds of different dream scenarios and their meanings. The stars, as always, were watched. The Mesopotamians developed one of the earliest systematic traditions of astronomical observation. recording the movements of the sun and moon and the 5 visible planets with a precision that would not be matched in the ancient world for centuries. They could predict eclipses, calculate the cycles of Venus, and construct a calendar that kept reasonably accurate track of the seasons. The observations were motivated in part by practical necessity, for the agricultural calendar depended on knowing when the equinoxes and solstices fell and when the flood could be expected. But they were also motivated by the belief that the stars were the writing of the gods, that the movements of the celestial bodies communicated divine intentions to those who could read them. The astrologers who performed this reading were among the most prestigious figures in Babylonian society, attached to the royal court and consulted on matters of state as well as personal fortune. Their reports to the king, written on small clay tablets, survive in the thousands, and they give a vivid picture of the relationship between celestial observation and political decision-making. A king planning a military campaign might delay it if the omens were unfavourable, or might perform purification rituals to neutralise a bad omen before proceeding. A king who fell ill might be temporarily replaced by a substitute king, a commoner or a prisoner who was made to perform the royal functions for a period, drawing any divine punishment onto himself and away from the real king, after which the substitute would be killed and the king restored to his throne. This last practice, strange and troubling to modern sensibilities, reflects the deep seriousness with which the Mesopotamians took the relationship between the king and the divine order. The king was not just a political leader but a cosmic figure, responsible for maintaining the right relationship between heaven and earth, between the gods and humanity. If that relationship was disturbed by some offence or misfortune, it was the king who bore the burden, and extraordinary measures might be required to restore the balance. Within this world, the memory of the sealed door, the knowledge that certain thresholds existed and had been closed by the Anunnaki before their withdrawal, was not a marginal belief or a fringe tradition. It was woven into the fabric of the religious life of the cities, present in the ritual texts that the priests studied and performed, embedded in the mythological narratives that the scribes copied and the storytellers retold, implicit in the architecture of the temples with their hidden chambers and their sealed shafts. It was part of the background understanding that informed everything else, the sense that the world had a structure, that the structure had been established by powers greater than humanity, and that certain features of that structure were beyond human ability or right to alter. The ordinary person walking through the market haggling over the price of a basket of dates was probably not thinking about sealed doors or divine withdrawals. They were thinking about the price of dates, about the toothache that had been troubling them for a week, about whether the landlord would accept a partial payment this month given that the harvest had been disappointing. But somewhere in the background of their consciousness, shaping their sense of what was possible and what was forbidden, what was sacred and what was profane, was the inherited understanding that the world had been made and ordered by the gods, that certain boundaries existed for good reasons, and that the role of humanity was to maintain those boundaries through faithful service and careful ritual. The smell of incense drifted from the temple gates, sweet and thick, a smell that the people associated with the divine presence even if they could not enter the inner sanctuaries where the incense was burned in the greatest concentration. The sound of hymns being chanted by the priests floated out over the walls of the temple complex at certain hours of the day, formal and rhythmic, the sound of the ancient words repeated by trained voices in a tradition that stretched back further than anyone could trace. And the great ziggurat rose above everything, its tiers casting shadows that moved slowly across the city as the sun travelled its arc, a permanent reminder of the boundary between earth and heaven, the place where the connection between the human and the divine was closest, and where the greatest care was required. In the scribal school attached to the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, the students would have copied the ritual texts, the hymns and the incantations and the omen collections as part of their training. They would have pressed into clay the words that describe the sealed door and the ritual for checking its seal, and they would have done so without necessarily understanding the full significance of what they were copying. For them, in the early stages of training, the exercise was about mastering the signs, about learning the correct forms and the conventional phrases. The meaning would come later, as they advanced in their studies and began to encounter the text in their full context. But for the senior scribes, the ones who had spent decades in the tradition and who understood the literature deeply, the sealed door was a concept with real weight. It represented the limit of human knowledge, the boundary between the accessible and the inaccessible, the known and the forever hidden. It was a humbling concept, and an ordering one. It said that the cosmos had a structure, that the structure had been established with purpose, and that not everything was available for human inspection or human use. Some things were meant to remain sealed, and the smoke rose in thin blue columns from the temple incense burners into the warm evening air, carrying the prayers of the faithful upward toward a heaven that was very close, and yet, by the decree of the great gods, no longer quite within reach. The relationship between the people of Mesopotamia and their gods was never simple, and it was never static. It changed across the centuries as empires rose and fell, as languages shifted and blended, as new peoples arrived from the desert margins and the mountain highlands, and brought their own stories and their own deities, weaving them into the existing fabric of belief until the resulting tapestry was rich and complex and sometimes difficult to read. But through all these changes, certain themes persisted, and among them the theme of divine presence and divine distance, of a closeness that had once existed and had been replaced by something more formal and more mediated, remained a constant thread. The priests who served in the temples were the primary mediators of this relationship, and their daily lives were shaped by the demands of that mediation in ways that touched every aspect of their existence. Becoming a priest was not a casual choice or a simple appointment. It required years of preparation, a body that met specific physical standards, for certain deformities or blemishes were considered incompatible with the requirements of the sacred, and a thorough education in the texts and rituals of the tradition. The candidate for the priesthood would be evaluated by the existing priests, and in some cases by divination, asking the gods themselves whether the candidate was acceptable. Once admitted, the young priest would begin a long apprenticeship in the outer functions of the temple, the most basic tasks of maintenance and service. He would sweep the courtyards, carry water, tend the oil lamps, assist the more senior priests in the preparation of offerings. Gradually, as his knowledge and his reliability were proven, he would be entrusted with more significant responsibilities, allowed to participate in the secondary rituals, to chant the hymns in the proper forms, to assist in the daily service of the god's statue. Only after many years would he be permitted to enter the inner sanctuary, and only after the most rigorous preparation would he be allowed to descend into the deeper chambers, the places where the most ancient rituals were performed, and where the memory of the sealed door was kept. The preparation for entering those deeper chambers involved a period of ritual purification that might last several days. The priest would abstain from certain foods, particularly meat and fish and garlic, foods that were considered to carry a spiritual charge that might interfere with the delicate work of maintaining the boundaries. He would bathe in water mixed with herbs and minerals, repeating specific incantations as he did so, and he would dress in freshly laundered linen, the white cloth that was the colour of purity and of the divine. He would not cut his hair or trim his beard during the preparatory period, and he would sleep in the temple rather than at home, maintaining his connection to the sacred space. On the day of the ritual itself, the priest would fast from dawn, taking nothing but water, and he would spend the morning hours in meditation and prayer, focusing his mind on the task ahead and on the meaning of what he was about to do. He would recite from memory the long incantations that prepared the ritual space, calling on the gods of the four directions to guard the boundaries, invoking the protection of Enki and the wisdom that he represented, and acknowledging the authority of the Anunnaki, whose decree the ritual was designed to honour. Then, as the sun passed its zenith and began its afternoon descent, the priest and his two assistants would approach the entrance to the subterranean chamber. The entrance was in the floor of a side room in the temple, covered by a stone slab that fitted precisely into its frame, its edges sealed with bitumen that had to be broken before the slab could be lifted. The breaking of the bitumen seal was itself a ritual act, performed with a specific tool, a bronze implement shaped like a crescent moon, and accompanied by a prayer that asked the gods to permit the opening and to protect those who entered. The descent was by means of a narrow stair, steep and worn smooth by generations of feet, cut into the bedrock below the temple floor. The lamp that the priest carried sent shadows leaping and dancing on the stone walls, and the air in the staircase was close and cool, the temperature dropping noticeably with each step. The smell changed too, from the incense-laden air of the temple above to something older and earthier, the smell of stone and compacted clay, and the faint mineral scent of groundwater not far below. At the bottom of the stair was a small antechamber, a room perhaps 2 meters on each side, with a low ceiling that required even a man of ordinary height to stoop slightly. The walls were smooth stone, unlike the mud brick of the structures above, suggesting that the chamber predated the current temple and belonged to an earlier phase of construction, or perhaps to a different architectural tradition entirely. On the walls there were inscriptions, carved rather than pressed, and therefore more permanent, though the text was old enough that the language and the script style differed from the standard forms in use when the sealed door tablet was written, requiring a scholar to read them. The inscriptions have not survived in a form that modern scholars can fully access, and the descriptions of them in the ritual texts are fragmentary and not entirely consistent. But the surviving references suggest that they included invocations of the Anunnaki, descriptions of the sealing of the door that occupied the far wall, and warnings to any who entered to approach with proper reverence and to depart without disturbing the seal. There may also have been a list of the names of the priests who had performed the ritual in previous generations, a record of the chain of transmission that connected the present performers to the ancient originators of the practice. The door itself, the western wall of the antechamber, was described in the ritual text as made of cedar wood, reinforced with bronze strips along the edges and the centre, with a clay plug set into the surface and impressed with the seal of the Anunnaki. Cedar was the finest timber available to the ancient Mesopotamians, imported from the forests of Lebanon at great expense, and its use in this context signals the importance attached to the door. The wood, protected by its underground location from the sun and the wind that would have cracked and dried it in the open air, might have survived for a very long time, though whether any such door physically exists today, hidden beneath the ruins of some Babylonian temple, is a question that no one can currently answer. The ritual of approaching the door was carefully prescribed. The priest would advance to within arm's length, not touching the door itself, and hold the lamp close to the clay plug to inspect it for any sign of disturbance. The plug was described as bearing specific marks, the impressions of a cylinder seal that was not in common use, perhaps a seal belonging to the temple's founding deity or to the Anunnaki themselves in some symbolic sense, and the priest would compare what he saw with the description preserved in the ritual text to confirm that the marks were correct and unchanged. He would then recite the prayer acknowledging the authority of the Anunnaki and affirming the integrity of the seal, make the offering of oil and bread on the small ledge near the door and withdraw. The two assistants remained at the foot of the stair throughout, holding a second lamp and ready to assist if the priest needed anything. They did not approach the door. Their role was partly practical, to provide light and assistance, and partly symbolic, witnesses to the performance of the ritual, whose presence ensured that it had been done correctly and could be attested to in the record that would be written afterward. The record was kept in the temple archives, a growing accumulation of tablets noting the date of each performance, the name of the priest who performed it, and a brief statement confirming that the seal was intact and the ritual completed. This record-keeping had a dual function. On the practical side, it established a schedule, ensuring that the ritual was performed at the appropriate intervals, neither neglected nor performed so frequently as to lose its significance. On the theological side, it was a form of testimony, a declaration addressed not just to future human readers, but to the gods themselves, confirming that the covenant implied by the sealed door was being honoured from the human side. The gods had sealed the door as an act of trust, trusting that humanity would maintain the boundary they had established, and the ritual was the human response to that trust, a regular affirmation of faithfulness. There were other sealed spaces in other temples and other rituals associated with them, though the details varied and not all were as carefully documented as the one described in the Sippar tablet. In the Temple of Enlil at Nippur, considered the religious capital of Sumer and the seat of the Divine Assembly, there were chambers in the foundation that were said to date from the very beginning of the temple, from the time when the gods themselves had laid the first bricks. These chambers were sealed and could not be entered even by the high priest, according to some accounts, because the divine decree that closed them was too absolute to be overridden by any human authority. The temple at Nippur occupied a commanding position in the centre of the city, built on a high mound of accumulated ruins that represented millennia of continuous occupation, each new temple built on the flattened remains of the one before. The mound, known as the Tummel, was one of the most sacred sites in Mesopotamia, and the right to control it was contested by successive rulers who understood that the authority to make offerings at the Temple of Enlil carried a kind of cosmic legitimacy that no military victory alone could confer. Kings came from across the region to make offerings at Nippur, to receive the blessing of Enlil, and to have their royal status confirmed by the priesthood of the most senior of the gods. In this context, the sealed chambers beneath the temple of Enlil were not just ritual curiosities but markers of absolute authority. They represented the innermost sanctum of divine power, the place where the boundary between the human and the divine was most absolute, where the decrees of the Anunnaki were most tangibly present. Their sealing was not a loss but a definition, a way of marking the difference between what belonged to the gods and what was given to humanity, between what was eternal and what was temporal. The priests who served at Nippur were among the most learned in the ancient world. The scribble school there, known from the tablets it produced, was one of the most important centres of literary and intellectual activity in the ancient Near East. Thousands of tablets have been recovered from Nippur, covering an enormous range of subjects, and many of the standard texts of the Sumerian literary tradition are known primarily from copies made at the Nippur school. The students there would have been trained in the full breadth of the cuneiform tradition, from the most basic accounting exercises to the most complex mythological and ritual texts. Among the texts taught at Nippur was a collection known to modern scholars as the Sumerian temple hymns, a set of 42 hymns, each one addressed to a specific temple in a specific city, praising the temple's qualities and the deity it housed and describing the rituals performed there. The hymns were composed, or at least collected and arranged, by Enheduanna, the priestess whose name we have already encountered, and they give a remarkable picture of the network of sacred spaces that existed across Sumer, each one a node in the web of divine-human relationship, each one a place where the boundary between the two realms was managed and maintained. The hymns are full of architectural imagery, of doors and gates and thresholds, of inner chambers and outer courts, of the path that the worshipper must travel to approach the deity, shedding worldly concerns with each step as the soul of the penitent in the descent of Inanna shed its adornments at each gate of the underworld. The journey from the profane to the sacred is always a journey inward and downward, from the noise and the open sky of the marketplace to the quiet and the lamplight of the inner sanctuary, from the surface of daily life to the deep places where the fundamental structures of the cosmos are maintained. This imagery of descent and interiority reflects something deep in the Mesopotamian religious imagination, a sense that the sacred is not up there, in the sky, but down here, below the surface, in the earth and in the water and in the depths of time. The gods dwell in the heavens, yes, but they also dwell in the Abzu, the underwater ocean, and in the underworld, and in the depths of the temples, and in the depths of the human heart. The sacred is not distant but hidden, not absent but veiled, and the work of the priesthood is to maintain the conditions under which the hidden can be accessed, carefully, ritually, with appropriate preparation and appropriate respect. The ordinary people who lived their daily lives in the dust and heat of the city understood this intuitively, even if they could not have articulated in the theological terms that the learned priests would have used. They knew that the temple was a place of power, and they approached it with care. They made their offerings at the outer gates, left their petitions with the priests who could transmit them to the inner sanctuary, and trusted that the system worked, that the rituals being performed in the depths of the building were maintaining the invisible structures that kept their world in order. When the rituals were performed correctly, the world ran as it should. The river rose and fell at the right times, the rains came, the grain grew, the children were born healthy, the city was protected from its enemies. When the rituals were neglected or performed improperly, things went wrong, or so the theology said, and the priests who failed in their duty bore a heavy responsibility for whatever disasters followed. This was not a comfortable theology, for it placed an enormous burden on the shoulders of those who served in the temples, but it was also a coherent one, and it gave the priestly class both their authority and their accountability. The theme of divine rivals and pressures, the forces that challenged the order maintained by the priests and the sealed boundaries of the gods, was a constant presence in the literature and in the political life of the region. Within the divine realm, the myths were full of conflicts between the gods, disagreements about how the world should be ordered and who should hold authority. Enlil and Enki were often portrayed as rivals, their different approaches to humanity, Enlil's stern discipline versus Enki's indulgent generosity, creating tensions that played out in the stories of the flood and the creation of humans and the assignment of the Mez, the divine principles that governed all aspects of civilized life. Within the human realm, the city-states of Sumer were almost perpetually at war with one another. fighting over water rights and boundary stones and trade routes and the prestige of controlling the most important temples. The walls of the cities, massive constructions of mud brick that took decades to build and constant maintenance to preserve, were testimony to the reality of this threat, the need to defend what had been built against neighbours who might covet it. And beyond the city-states lay the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of the desert margins, the Amorites and later the Aramaeans, who pressed against the settled lands when their own resources were insufficient, and who sometimes swept in to conquer and settle, becoming in time the new ruling class of the cities they had taken. Each conquest brought changes to the religious landscape, as the conquerors introduced their own gods and their own stories into the existing system, but the process was rarely one of replacement. More often it was one of absorption and synthesis, with the new gods being identified with the old ones, or given new roles in the existing hierarchy. Marduk, the city god of Babylon, rose to the top of the divine hierarchy, not because the Babylonians destroyed the older tradition, but because they absorbed it, claiming that Marduk was the true king of the gods, the one who had always been supreme even if he had not always been recognized as such. The Enuma Elish, the creation epic in which Marduk defeats Tiamat and becomes king of the gods, was in part a theological argument for this claim, a story designed to establish Marduk's primacy in a way that the older traditions could accommodate. But even as the divine hierarchy was reorganized and reinterpreted, the older stories about the Anunnaki and their role in shaping the world persisted. The Anunnaki were older than any particular city's patron deity, older than the distinctions between Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian, and their authority was grounded in the fundamental structures of the cosmos itself, in the establishment of the me, the divine principles, in the setting of the stars in their courses, in the creation of humanity and the giving of civilization. The sealed door, attributed to the Anunnaki, carried the weight of this primordial authority, an authority that no subsequent reorganization of the divine hierarchy could overturn. In the late periods of Babylonian history, when the empire was under pressure from external enemies and internal divisions, the theme of divine withdrawal became more urgent. The priests and scholars who maintained the temple traditions were acutely aware that the world they served was fragile, that the cities had fallen before and could fall again, and that the knowledge preserved in the temple libraries was not guaranteed to survive. They redoubled their efforts to copy and preserve the most important texts, to train new generations of scribes in the full breadth of the tradition, and to ensure that the rituals were performed with the greatest possible care and precision. In this climate of anxiety, the sealed door took on an additional meaning. It was not just a reminder of the divine withdrawal of the past, but a symbol of hope for the future, a promise that what had been sealed could potentially be unsealed, that the door the Anunnaki had closed before their departure might one day be opened again. The text did not explicitly promise this, and the priests were careful not to claim more than the tradition warranted, but the possibility was implicit in the very act of sealing, for a door that has been sealed can, in principle, be unsealed. The question was not whether the door could be opened, but whether the conditions that would permit its opening had been met, or would ever be met, in the lifetime of any living person. And the candles in the temple burned on through the night, one generation of priests handing the flame to the next, keeping the light alive in the inner chambers while the world outside went about its business of living and dying and forgetting, one careful step at a time. The world that had sustained the great temple cities of Mesopotamia for more than 3,000 years did not end in a single catastrophic moment. It ended the way most things end, slowly, unevenly, with periods of apparent recovery followed by deeper declines, with individual acts of preservation and individual acts of destruction occurring almost simultaneously, so that those living through it could not always tell whether things were getting better or worse, whether the tradition would survive or whether they were witnessing its final hours. The pressures that would eventually overwhelm the cuneiform world came from many directions at once, and they had been building for centuries before they reached the critical point. To understand them, it helps to step back and look at the broader map of the ancient Near East during the first millennium before the Common Era, a period of extraordinary turbulence and transformation that would reshape the political and cultural landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Iran. The Assyrian Empire, which reached its greatest extent in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, was one of the most powerful military states the ancient world had yet seen. The Assyrian kings built an empire that stretched from Egypt in the west to the borders of Persia in the east, and they maintained it through a combination of military terror, sophisticated administration, and a policy of deporting conquered populations to break up local resistance and create a more homogeneous and more easily controlled subject people. The Assyrians were also, somewhat paradoxically, great patrons of learning and of the cuneiform tradition, and the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which we have mentioned several times, was the most comprehensive collection of cuneiform literature ever assembled, a deliberate effort to gather the wisdom of the ancient world in a single place under royal patronage. Ashurbanipal himself claimed to be literate in the ancient tongue, able to read the cuneiform script including the older Sumerian forms, and he sent agents across the empire to collect tablets and have them copied for his library. The collection included myths, hymns, omens, medical texts, mathematical texts, legal codes, historical chronicles, and literary works of all kinds, and it represented the accumulated learning of more than 2,000 years of scribal tradition. When the library was excavated in the 19th century, the tens of thousands of tablets recovered from its ruins gave modern scholars their first comprehensive view of the cuneiform literary tradition, and many of the key texts we have been discussing, including the fragments that mention the sealed door, came from this collection. But the Assyrian Empire, for all its power, could not sustain itself. The costs of constant military expansion were enormous, the subject populations were restive and frequently in revolt, and the administrative demands of governing such a vast territory exceeded the capacity of even the most efficient ancient state. By the late 7th century, the cracks were showing, and when the Babylonians and the Medes formed an alliance against Assyria, the empire collapsed with startling speed. Nineveh itself, the great capital, fell to the Allied forces in the year that later scholars would mark as 612 before the Common Era, and the destruction was thorough enough that within a generation the city was effectively abandoned, its ruins beginning the long process of burial under the desert sands that would eventually conceal them for more than 2 millennia. The fall of Nineveh brought a kind of grim satisfaction to those who had suffered under Assyrian rule, and the Hebrew prophet Nahum captured something of this feeling in words that were preserved in the biblical tradition. But the fall of Nineveh did not end the cuneiform world. Babylon, the great city on the Euphrates, rose to new heights of power and prosperity under the Neo-Babylonian kings, most famously Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled for more than 4 decades in the late 7th and early 6th centuries, and who transformed Babylon into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the temples, enlarged the palace complex, constructed the Great Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue-glazed bricks decorated with images of lions and bulls and dragons, and embarked on building projects that employed thousands of workers over decades. The Temple of Marduk, known as Esagila, was restored and expanded, and the great ziggurat of Babylon, the Anunnaki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was rebuilt to its full height, a structure so impressive that later traditions would identify it with the Tower of Babel, described in the Hebrew Scriptures. In this period of Babylonian revival, the cuneiform scribal tradition continued to flourish. The temple schools trained new generations of scribes, the ritual texts were copied and updated, and the astronomical observations that had been accumulating for centuries were systematized into new and more accurate predictive frameworks. The Babylonian astronomers of this period developed mathematical methods for calculating planetary positions with a precision that would not be surpassed in the ancient world until the Greeks built on their foundations. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire was shorter lived than its achievements might suggest. In 539 before the Common Era, the Persian king Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon essentially without resistance, welcomed, according to the Persian account and some Babylonian sources, as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The priests of Marduk, who had grown alienated from the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, a man with unconventional religious views who had neglected the festivals of Marduk in favour of the moon god Sin, apparently preferred Persian rule to continuing under Nabonidus. Cyrus was careful to present himself as a respecter of Babylonian tradition, honouring the gods of the city and maintaining the existing administrative structures, and in the short term the transition was relatively smooth. For the cuneiform scribal tradition, the Persian conquest was not immediately catastrophic. The Persians adopted some aspects of Babylonian administrative practice, and cuneiform continued to be used for official purposes alongside the Aramaic script that was becoming the standard for everyday written communication across the empire. The temples continued to function, the priests continued to perform their rituals, and the scribes continued to copy the ancient texts. But the context had shifted, and the shift was significant. Aramaic, a Semitic language that had been spreading across the ancient Near East for centuries, was better suited to certain practical purposes than cuneiform, primarily because it was written with an alphabetic script on perishable materials such as papyrus and leather rather than on clay tablets. An alphabetic script with 22 letters is far easier to learn and use than a syllabic script with hundreds of signs, and the materials used for Aramaic writing were lighter and cheaper than clay. As a result, Aramaic gradually displaced cuneiform in the commercial and administrative domains, leaving cuneiform increasingly confined to the specialized world of the temple scribes, who maintained it for ritual and scholarly purposes. This confinement was both a form of preservation and a form of death. As long as the temples functioned and the priestly schools trained new scribes in the old script, the cuneiform tradition survived. But the base of people who could read and write cuneiform was narrowing, and with it the tradition's ability to renew itself and to speak to the wider world. The great texts that had once been at the centre of intellectual and religious life were becoming the property of a small, specialised group of scholars who read them in isolation from the broader culture that had produced them. The conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great in the late 4th century before the Common Era brought further disruption. Alexander himself showed respect for the traditions of the peoples he conquered, and he even planned to restore the ziggurat of Babylon, which had fallen into disrepair, but he died before the project could be completed. His successors, the Seleucid kings who divided his empire among themselves, were less consistently sympathetic to Babylonian tradition, and the process of Hellenization, the spread of Greek language and culture, introduced new intellectual and religious frameworks that competed with the old ones. The city of Babylon itself went into a long decline during the Seleucid period, as the new rulers favoured their own capital at Seleucia, on the Tigris over the old Babylonian city. The population began to drift away, the temples lost resources and influence, and the once magnificent cityscape began to deteriorate. The priests who remained did their best to maintain the traditions, but they were working against the current of history and they knew it. In the scribal schools that still functioned during this period, the students continued to copy the ancient texts, but now they were copying in a world that was increasingly Greek in its cultural orientation, a world where the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle was beginning to circulate, and where the old mythological frameworks were being questioned and reinterpreted. Some Babylonian scholars engaged with Greek thought, and some Greek thinkers were genuinely interested in Babylonian wisdom, particularly in the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that the Babylonian tradition had developed over centuries. There was a period of real intellectual exchange, with Babylonian astronomers and Greek philosophers meeting in the temple precincts and in the courts of the Seleucid kings, each learning from the other. But the exchange was asymmetrical. The Greeks were in a position of cultural dominance, and Babylonian knowledge tended to be absorbed into Greek frameworks rather than the reverse. The Babylonian astronomical observations and mathematical techniques were adopted by Greek astronomers and eventually fed into the tradition that would produce Ptolemy, and much later, Copernicus and Kepler. But the mythological and theological context in which those observations had originally been embedded was largely lost in translation. The rich narrative of the gods and their relationships with the cosmos reduced to a set of techniques and data points that could be used without reference to their original meaning. For the priests and scribes who maintained the cuneiform tradition in this period, the sense of loss must have been palpable. They were the custodians of a world that was fading, guardians of a door that fewer and fewer people could even see, let alone approach with proper reverence. The rituals continued, but the community that gave them meaning was shrinking. The shared understanding that made the symbols powerful was eroding, and the threat of silence was growing. The texts from this late period sometimes have a quality of urgency, of people writing as though they know they may be the last to do so. Colophons become more detailed, noting not just the name of the scribe and the date, but the circumstances of the copying, the fact that the original tablet was damaged, or that the source was rare and difficult to obtain. There are records of deliberate efforts to gather and preserve texts, to bring them together from scattered temple libraries into central collections, as though the scribes understood that the dispersal of the tradition was a threat, and that concentration offered the best chance of survival. One such collection, assembled in the city of Uruk in the late Seleucid period, contained a remarkable range of texts, including astronomical calculations, ritual instructions, mythological narratives, and lexical lists of signs and their meanings. The Uruk scribes of this period are known by name from their colophons, and they can be tracked across several generations, father teaching son, uncle teaching nephew, the tradition passing through specific families who held it with something like fierce devotion. They continued to use the cuneiform script and the Akkadian and Sumerian languages for their most important texts, even as Aramaic and eventually Greek became the languages of everyday life around them. Among the texts preserved at Uruk in this period was a copy of a ritual text that referenced the sealed door, apparently a descendant of the same tradition as the Sippar tablet, but with some variations in the specific details of the ritual, perhaps reflecting local practice or the passage of time. The Uruk version added a note in the colophon that had not been present in the earlier version, a note that has attracted the attention of modern scholars. The note says, approximately, that the tablet was copied because the previous copy was falling apart, and because the copyist feared that if it were lost, no one would remember the proper way to honour the place where the Great Ones had sealed the boundary between the ages. The phrase is brief and businesslike, written in the flat, unemotional style of the scribal colophon, but its implications are moving. The scribe who wrote those words understood that something was ending, that the living tradition, in which the ritual had been performed regularly and understood deeply, was giving way to something more fragile, a preservation of the form without the full community of practice that had once given it life. He was making a copy not because the ritual was about to be performed and the text was needed, but because the text might otherwise be lost, and the loss of the text might mean the loss of the memory of what the door had meant and what the Anunnaki had done when they sealed it. There is something deeply human in this act. The scribe working by lamplight in a temple that was already half empty, pressing the ancient signs into fresh clay with the same care that his predecessors had used 2,000 years before, knowing that he might be one of the last who could. The lamp oil burned slowly, the stylus moved steadily, and the words were saved, though the world that had produced them was already beginning to pass. The pressure on the cuneiform tradition came not only from without, from the Greek culture and the Aramaic script and the changing political landscape, but also from within, from the theological and philosophical challenges that the new intellectual environment posed. The Babylonian mythology, with its assembly of gods and its stories of divine conflict and divine withdrawal, sat uneasily in a world where Greek philosophy was raising questions about the nature of the divine, about whether the gods could be many or must be one, about whether the universe was governed by personal powers or by impersonal principles. The Jewish community in Babylon, which had been established by the deportees brought there by Nebuchadnezzar, and which had remained even after Cyrus permitted their return to their homeland, maintained a strict monotheism that contrasted sharply with the polytheism of the Babylonian tradition. The interaction between the two communities over the centuries had produced a complex cultural exchange, with Jewish scholars absorbing certain elements of Babylonian astronomical and calendrical knowledge, and Babylonian mythology leaving traces in the stories preserved in the Hebrew scriptures, the flood narrative, the creation story, certain details of the law codes, all of which show points of contact with the cuneiform tradition. But the fundamental theological difference remained, and in the long run it was the monotheistic tradition, or rather the several monotheistic traditions that emerged in this period, that would define the religious culture of the region for the centuries to come. The gods of the Babylonian pantheon, the Anunnaki and the Igigi, and the great deities of the city-states, would not survive as living religious objects of worship. They would survive only as names in texts, as subjects of scholarly inquiry, as characters in stories that were increasingly read as myth rather than as theology. The crisis of the cuneiform world was therefore not primarily a military or political crisis, though the military and political changes contributed to it. It was a crisis of meaning, a situation in which the framework of understanding that the tradition provided was losing its hold on the minds and hearts of the people it had once served. The rituals continued, but they continued in a shrinking space, maintained by a dedicated minority, while the majority of the population moved toward different frameworks of meaning. And in those shrinking temples, in the chambers where the lamp oil still burned and the incense still rose, the priests who remained performed their duties with the same care that their ancestors had brought to the work. They descended into the subterranean chambers, they approached the sealed door, they recited the prayers acknowledging the authority of the Anunnaki and affirming that the seal was intact. They made their offerings and recorded their rituals and trained whatever students came to them, fewer each generation, until the generation arrived that would be the last. The last generation of cuneiform scribes left no dramatic testament, no farewell inscription, no final prayer to mark the end of a tradition that had lasted for 3,000 years. They simply stopped, their numbers dwindling until there was no one left who could read the signs, or perform the rituals, or copy the texts. The tablets they left behind lay in the ruins of the buildings that had housed them, buried slowly under the accumulating debris of fallen mud brick and wind-blown sand, waiting in silence for a future that the scribes themselves could not have imagined. A future in which the signs they had pressed into clay with such care would be found again, and read again by people who had spent years learning a dead script in order to hear voices that had been silent for 2 millennia. The sealed door, wherever it was, remained sealed. The Anunnaki, having departed before any living person could remember, did not return. And the world went on without them, changed and changing, the old stories fading from living memory and passing into the deeper layers of time, where they would lie until someone thought to dig. The silence that fell over the cuneiform world was not absolute, and it was not immediate. It came in stages, like the slow withdrawal of a tide that leaves behind, as it recedes, scattered objects on a darkening shore. Some temples continued to function into the Parthian period, which began when the Iranian Parthian dynasty overthrew the Seleucid kings in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Some scribes continued to write in cuneiform into the 1st century of the Common Era, pressing the ancient wedges into clay in a world that had otherwise moved entirely to ink and papyrus and parchment. The latest known cuneiform tablet, an astronomical text from Babylon, is dated to the year 74 or 75 of the Common Era, a date that falls within the lifetime of the Apostles, within the years when the New Testament was being written in Greek, when Rome was the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, and when the destruction of Jerusalem by Roman forces was still fresh in living memory. That final tablet, written by an astronomer who was perhaps the last living person who could write in cuneiform, is a striking object to contemplate. It represents the end of a tradition that began more than 3,000 years before its final expression, a tradition that had produced some of the most enduring works of human imagination, had developed the first writing system, had laid the foundations of mathematics and astronomy, had preserved the stories that echoed through later literatures and mythologies, and had maintained through all the centuries of change and upheaval the memory of the Anunnaki and the door they had sealed before they left. After that final tablet, there was silence. The cuneiform script was forgotten. The Akkadian and Sumerian languages ceased to be spoken. The cities of the ancient world, already long in decline, continued their slow collapse into rubble, their mud brick walls dissolving in the rain, their streets filling with debris, their great buildings sinking into the mounds that the local people would call by various names: Tel in Arabic, Tepe in Persian, Huyuk in Turkish, each word simply meaning a hill or a mound, without reference to what lay beneath. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, did not become empty. It continued to be farmed and traded and fought over, first by the Parthians, then by the Sassanid Persians, then by the Arab armies that swept through in the 7th century of the Common Era, bringing with them the new faith of Islam and a new language and a new set of cultural frameworks. The new inhabitants of the land built their own cities, some of them on or near the sites of the ancient ones, and they farmed the same fields and drew water from the same rivers, but they had no memory of the civilizations buried beneath their feet. The mounds were simply landscape features, hills among the flat plain, sometimes useful as defensive positions or as sites for new construction, sometimes avoided as places of ill omen or supernatural danger. Legends accumulated around some of them, stories of ancient kings and buried treasure, of demons and spirits that guarded hidden wealth. These legends bore no specific relationship to the actual history of the sites. They were the generic folklore of haunted places, applied to the mounds because the mounds were old and mysterious, and nothing was known about what they contained. In the medieval Islamic world, scholars of extraordinary breadth and learning were at work across a vast geographic area, preserving and translating the intellectual heritage of the ancient world, including much of the Greek philosophical and scientific tradition that might otherwise have been lost. The great translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries centered in Baghdad, the Abbasid capital that was itself built not far from the ruins of Babylon, produced Arabic translations of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and dozens of other Greek authors, and in doing so preserved the content of those works for future generations in Europe and elsewhere. But the cuneiform tradition had not passed through Greek hands in a way that made it available for translation. The Greek authors had absorbed certain elements of Babylonian knowledge, the astronomical data, some mathematical techniques, certain mythological motifs that can be traced through the works of Hesiod and Homer and the later writers. But the cuneiform texts themselves, the original sources in Akkadian and Sumerian, were unknown in the Greek world except in the most fragmentary and second-hand form, and by the time of the Arabic translation movement, the script had been unreadable for centuries and the languages were completely dead. So the medieval scholars in Baghdad, sitting in their libraries with their oil lamps and their rolls of papyrus and their reed pens, were unaware that beneath the mounds visible from their city lay tablets that contained stories older than anything in the Greek corpus, stories that anticipated the flood narrative of the Hebrew scriptures, stories that described the creation of the world and the nature of the gods, and the relationship between the human and the divine in ways that would have fascinated and perhaps disturbed the theological and philosophical frameworks they were working within. Occasionally, a traveller or a scholar would notice the mounds and comment on them. The Arab geographer and historian Yaqut, writing in the early 13th century, mentioned the ruins of Babylon and noted that they were a place of wonder, the remains of something very great, though he could not say what exactly the builders had been or what their civilization had achieved. Other medieval writers attributed the ruins to figures from Islamic or biblical tradition, to Nimrod, the mighty hunter, to Alexander the Great, to the legendary kings of the ancient world whose names had been preserved in a garbled form in later literature. The Babylonian ruins were sometimes associated with the Tower of Babel, the biblical story of the great tower built by humanity in its pride, reaching toward heaven until God confused the builders' tongues and scattered them across the earth. The ziggurat of Babylon, or rather the vast mound of its remains, visible for miles across the flat plain, was the obvious candidate for this identification, and medieval travellers who passed through the region sometimes recorded seeing the remains of what they identified as Babel, treating it as a place of religious significance and moral instruction, a monument to human hubris and divine correction. There is an irony in this identification that would have been apparent had anyone been able to read the cuneiform tablets buried in the ruins. The story of the Tower of Babel in the Hebrew scriptures is widely believed by scholars to reflect, however distantly, the Babylonian building tradition, the real ziggurats that dominated the Mesopotamian skyline and that represented in the Babylonian theological imagination not human pride but the proper relationship between earth and heaven, the bridge that connected the two realms and maintained the cosmic order. But in the biblical retelling, the ziggurat became a symbol of human overreach, of the attempt to break through the boundary between the human and the divine, and the confusion of tongues became the divine response to that overreach, a sealing of the connection between humanity and the heavens. This parallel with the theme of the sealed door is suggestive. In both the Mesopotamian and the biblical traditions, there is the same underlying narrative, a time when the connection between the human and the divine was more direct, an act of divine will that closed or complicated that connection, and a world left to manage the aftermath. The specific details differ enormously. The theological frameworks are very different, and one should not push the parallel too far. But the resonance is real, and it reflects the shared cultural environment from which both traditions emerged, the same landscape, the same rivers, the same ancient stories told and retold and transformed across the centuries. The long night of forgetting continued through the medieval period and into the early modern era. European travellers who visited the Middle East from the 16th century onward began to take a more systematic interest in the ruins they encountered, and some of them collected small objects from the surface of the mounds, fragments of pottery and brick and occasionally clay tablets with strange marks on them. These objects were brought back to Europe as curiosities, displayed in the collections of wealthy patrons and occasionally puzzled over by scholars who had no means of understanding what they were looking at. The first serious attempts at excavation came in the early 19th century, driven by a combination of scholarly curiosity, imperial ambition, and the romantic fascination with the ancient world that characterized the intellectual culture of the era. The French and the British were the primary players in the early years, their diplomatic representatives in the Ottoman Empire competing with each other for access to the most promising sites and for the most spectacular finds. The ruins of Nineveh, near the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq, attracted particular attention because of their association with the biblical narrative, and the excavations there by Austin Henry Layard and his colleagues in the 1840s and 50s produced finds of extraordinary importance, including the winged bulls and lions, the reliefs of Assyrian kings, and the library of Ashurbanipal with its tens of thousands of clay tablets. The tablets were shipped to the British Museum in London, where they joined a growing collection of cuneiform material from various sites. They arrived packed in wooden crates, often broken, their surfaces sometimes further damaged by the journey, and the task of cataloguing and studying them fell to a small group of scholars who were simultaneously working on the problem of decipherment. The decipherment was a collaborative achievement, building on the work of several generations of scholars in England, France, Germany and Ireland, and it proceeded in stages over the course of the 19th century, with major breakthroughs coming at intervals as new bilingual inscriptions were found and new analytical methods were applied. One of the key figures in the later stages of the decipherment was George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist who worked at the British Museum as an engraver and who spent his evenings and spare hours studying the cuneiform tablets in the collection. Smith had an extraordinary natural aptitude for the work, and in the early 1870s he made a discovery that created a sensation in the scholarly world and far beyond it. Working through the tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, he identified a text that described a great flood, a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, survived by a single man who built a boat and saved his family and the animals. The text was clearly related to the flood story in the book of Genesis, predating it by centuries if not millennia, and its discovery raised profound questions about the relationship between the biblical tradition and the older mythological traditions of Mesopotamia. Smith announced his discovery in a public lecture in December of 1872, and the reaction was extraordinary. The story of the flood tablet was front-page news in London and around the world, and the Daily Telegraph, a major newspaper of the day, offered to fund an expedition to Nineveh to search for the missing portions of the tablet, which Smith had identified from gaps in the text. Smith travelled to Nineveh and, in what seemed almost miraculous to his contemporaries, found additional fragments of the flood text within days of arriving at the site, completing the narrative in its essential outline. The discovery of the flood tablet opened a new era in the study of the ancient Near East. Suddenly the cuneiform tablets were not merely administrative records or obscure religious texts. They were literature, mythology, narrative, the oldest stories in the world, preserved in clay and waiting to speak again after 2,000 years of silence. The scholars who worked on the tablets in the decades that followed found themselves in the position of the first readers of an enormous library, a library whose catalogue was still being assembled, whose contents were only partially understood, and whose revelations seemed to multiply with every new fragment that was read. Among the texts that emerged from this great work of decipherment and study were the ritual texts we have been discussing, the hymns and incantations and priestly handbooks that describe the daily life of the temples and the maintenance of the boundaries between the human and the divine. These texts were less immediately dramatic than the flood story or the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they attracted less public attention, but for the scholars who specialised in them, they were no less important. They provided a window into the lived religion of the ancient world, into the actual practices and beliefs that animated the temples and gave meaning to the mythology. The fragment that would come to be called the sealed door tablet, the Sippar tablet describing the ritual for checking and honouring the sealed door in the subterranean chamber of the temple, was identified and partially translated in the early 20th century as part of a broader project of cataloguing and studying the ritual texts in the British Museum collection. The scholar who first drew attention to it noted the parallel with other references to sealed spaces and divine withdrawal in the cuneiform literature, and suggested that the tablet was part of a tradition that reflected a genuine and widespread belief in the ancient Mesopotamian world, the belief that the gods had once been more present and had subsequently withdrawn, sealing certain thresholds behind them as they departed. This interpretation was not universally accepted. Other scholars argued that the sealed door was entirely metaphorical, a way of expressing the theological idea that certain knowledge was reserved for the divine and could not be accessed by mortals. Still others suggested that the physical door described in the ritual text was simply a practical measure, a way of protecting a sacred space from unauthorized entry, and that the attribution of the sealing to the Anunnaki was a later mythologization of what had originally been a mundane administrative decision. The debate has not been fully resolved, and perhaps it cannot be given the fragmentary nature of the evidence. But the range of positions taken by serious scholars reflects the genuine ambiguity of the ancient material, its openness to multiple interpretations, and the difficulty of recovering the precise beliefs of people who lived thousands of years ago from the incomplete records they left behind. What can be said with confidence is that the idea of the sealed door, whatever its ultimate referent, was meaningful and persistent. It appeared in different forms across different periods and different cities, embedded in the mythology, the ritual practice, and the architectural imagination of the Mesopotamian world. It expressed something that the people of that world needed to express, something about the nature of the cosmos and the limits of human access to the divine, something about the transition from an age of closeness to an age of distance, something about the responsibilities and the consolations of living in a world that has been ordered by powers greater than oneself. The scribes who copied the ritual texts were not merely preserving information. They were participating in a tradition, keeping alive a set of practices and beliefs that gave meaning to the world they inhabited. When the last of them pressed the final tablet and set down his stylus for the last time, he was not simply stopping work. He was, without knowing it, entrusting the tradition to the silence of the earth, to the patient accumulation of dust and rubble that would protect the tablets from the centuries until the moment came for them to be found again. That moment came slowly, fitfully, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, as excavations across Iraq and Syria and Iran brought more and more of the ancient world back into the light. Each new season of excavation added to the corpus of known texts, filled in gaps in the understanding of specific periods and places, and occasionally produced a find of particular significance, a new literary text, a royal archive, a temple library, that changed the picture in important ways. The physical landscape of ancient Mesopotamia proved to be an extraordinary archive. The mud brick buildings, so fragile in the open air, became remarkably durable once buried, their walls compressed and preserved by the weight of subsequent construction above them. The clay tablets, which would dissolve in rain but were nearly indestructible when baked, survived in enormous numbers, sometimes still arranged on the shelves where the ancient scribes had placed them, sometimes scattered and broken by the collapse of the building, but still readable once the fragments were assembled and studied. Each tablet that was found and read was a voice from the silence, a connection across the vast gulf of time between the ancient world and the modern one. And among those voices were the voices of the priests who had descended into the subterranean chambers of the temples, who had approached the sealed door with their lamps and their incense, who had recited the prayers acknowledging the authority of the Anunnaki and affirming that the boundary was intact. Their words, pressed into clay in the dim light of the temple lamp, had survived everything that the centuries could throw at them, and they were speaking again. The land itself seemed to hold its breath across those long-buried centuries, the silt settling layer upon layer over the broken walls and the scattered tablets, the river shifting in its course but always returning to the same great plain, the stars turning overhead in the same paths they had always followed, indifferent to the rise and fall of the civilizations below them. The excavations that brought the ancient world of Mesopotamia back into human awareness were not conducted in a spirit of pure scholarly disinterest. They took place within the context of imperial rivalries, national ambitions, and the complex politics of a region that was itself undergoing profound transformation. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled the territories of modern Iraq and Syria during the early period of excavation, had its own attitudes toward the ancient ruins within its borders, attitudes that shifted between indifference and occasional possessiveness as the value of the finds became more apparent. The European powers, primarily Britain and France, operated within the framework of diplomatic permissions and informal understandings that gave them considerable latitude in what they removed from the sites they excavated. The result was that the great collections of cuneiform material ended up scattered across institutions in London, Paris, Berlin, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other cities far from the land where the tablets had been made and used. The British Museum holds the largest collection, including most of the tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, but significant collections exist in the Louvre, in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. Each of these institutions has contributed to the ongoing work of translating, cataloguing, and interpreting the ancient texts, and together they represent an extraordinary concentration of scholarly resources applied to the recovery of a lost world. The work of interpretation has never been straightforward. The cuneiform script, as we have seen, is not a simple system, and the languages it was used to write, Sumerian and Akkadian, in their various dialects and registers, have no living descendants and must be reconstructed entirely from the written evidence. The vocabulary of these languages is still not fully understood. There are words that appear in only one or two texts, and whose meaning can only be guessed from context. There are passages where the grammar is ambiguous, where 2 or 3 different translations are all equally plausible, where the choice between them depends on interpretive frameworks that the scholar brings to the text rather than on the text itself. The ritual texts present particular challenges because they often assume knowledge that the ancient reader would have had, knowledge of the specific context in which the ritual was performed, the layout of the temple, the identity of the officiants, the sequence of other rituals that surrounded and gave meaning to the one being described, and that is no longer available to the modern scholar. A phrase that would have been immediately clear to a Babylonian priest might be completely opaque to a modern reader, without access to that contextual knowledge. The result is that translations of ritual texts often contain more uncertainty, more hedging, more acknowledgement of ambiguity than translations of literary or administrative texts. The sealed door tablet is a good example of these challenges. The key phrase that describes the purpose of the door, the phrase that refers to the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, and the sealing of the threshold, has been translated in several different ways by scholars who have studied it. Some translations emphasize the temporal aspect, reading it as describing something that happened in the distant past before the flood or before the beginning of historical memory. Others emphasize the ongoing nature of the divine withdrawal, reading it as describing a condition that is still in effect, a present state of affairs rather than a past event. Still others have suggested that the phrase should be read as a conditional, a statement of what will happen when the Anunnaki depart, a future event rather than a past one. Each of these readings changes the meaning of the ritual significantly. If the sealing happened in the past, then the ritual is a commemoration, a way of honouring and maintaining a boundary that was established long ago. If the sealing is ongoing, then the ritual is a participation in a continuous process, a contribution to the work that the Anunnaki are still doing. And if the sealing is future, then the ritual is a preparation, a practice run for a threshold event that is still to come. The ambiguity is not merely academic. It reflects a genuine uncertainty about how the ancient people who performed the ritual understood what they were doing, and that uncertainty is itself historically significant. The scholar who first systematically drew attention to these interpretive issues was working in the mid-20th century, a period when the academic study of ancient Mesopotamia was maturing and beginning to engage more rigorously with the literary and religious dimensions of the cuneiform material, rather than focusing primarily on the historical and administrative texts that had dominated scholarship in the earlier period. This scholar, working in collaboration with colleagues in several countries, produced a study of the sealed door references across the cuneiform literature that remains a foundational text in the field, even though some of its specific conclusions have been revised by subsequent research. The study noted that references to sealed doors and sealed thresholds appear in texts from virtually every period of the cuneiform tradition, from the early Sumerian city-states through the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, and into the late periods when the tradition was in its final decline. This consistency across time and place suggests that the theme was not a passing fashion or a local peculiarity, but a deep structure of the Mesopotamian religious imagination, something that expressed a fundamental aspect of how the people of that world understood their relationship to the divine. The study also drew attention to the spatial aspect of the sealed door theme, the way it was consistently associated with downward movement, with depth and interiority, with the parts of the temple that were below or within rather than above or outside. The divine withdrawal was not imagined as the gods moving upward, away from the earth and into the sky, though that imagery also exists in the literature. It was imagined as a withdrawal into depth, into the Abzu, into the subterranean chambers, into the underworld, as though the divine had not left the earth but retreated to its interior, sealed inside rather than departed outside. This is a subtle but important distinction. A god who has gone away is simply absent, but a god who has retreated to the interior, who dwells in the depths behind a sealed door, is present in a different way, contained rather than absent, hidden rather than gone. The sealed door does not mark the end of the divine, but its concealment, and the ritual of checking the seal is not a memorial to something lost, but an acknowledgement of something hidden, something still there, still powerful, still deserving of respect, but no longer accessible in the direct way that the mythological past had described. This reading gives the ritual a different quality than it would have if the sealing simply marked an absence. It makes the ritual an act of relationship rather than an act of commemoration, a way of maintaining a connection with the divine presence that, though hidden, is not gone. The priest approaching the door is not visiting a closed chapter of history. He is standing at the threshold of something still alive, still present, still capable of responding to the faithful attention of those who honour the boundary it maintains. Whether this was how the ancient priests themselves understood the ritual is impossible to say with certainty, but there is support for this reading in the texts. The prayers recited at the sealed door are not written in the past tense, as they would be if they were purely commemorative. They are written in a kind of eternal present, addressing the Anunnaki as though they can hear and respond, asking for their continued protection and guidance, treating the relationship as ongoing rather than concluded. The priest does not say, in effect, we remember when you were here. He says, in effect, we know you are here, hidden behind this door, and we honour your presence and your decree. The transition from a living tradition of sealed door rituals to an archaeological and scholarly problem, from a practice performed with genuine belief to a set of fragmentary texts interpreted by people who learned a dead language in order to read them, is one of the most poignant narratives in the history of human knowledge. It is a transition that was completed gradually, over the course of the centuries between the last known cuneiform tablet and the first modern translation, but its outlines are clear enough to be traced. The moment of burial, when the last temples were abandoned and the clay tablets were left in the ruins of the buildings that had housed them, was not a single moment but a process, a slow accumulation of silence and dust. The priests who served in the last functioning temples of the late cuneiform period were almost certainly aware that their tradition was dying. They could see the empty benches in the scribal school, the shrinking number of students who came to learn the ancient signs, the deteriorating condition of the temple buildings that fewer and fewer hands were available to maintain. They knew that the world around them had moved on, that the people who came to the temple for the public festivals were fewer than they had been a generation ago, and that the languages of scholarship and of everyday life had diverged so far from the cuneiform tradition that the gap could no longer be bridged. Some of them perhaps found consolation in the belief that they were maintaining something important, something whose importance did not depend on whether it was currently recognised or appreciated. The ritual of the sealed door, if it was still being performed in those final years, would have been performed by a very small group of very dedicated people, keeping alive a practice that had been handed down through dozens of generations, honouring a boundary that had been established in a time so remote that it passed beyond historical memory into myth. And then, at some point, the last of them stopped. The lamp was not relit. The incense was not prepared. The narrow staircase that led down to the antechamber was left unswept, and the dust that settled on the steps was not disturbed again for centuries, or for millennia. The clay plug on the door, the seal impressed with the symbols of the Anunnaki, remained intact, as it had been maintained by every generation of priests who had performed the ritual. Whatever lay beyond the door, if anything lay beyond the door, remained there, undisturbed and unseen. The period of burial, the long centuries during which the tablets lay in silence beneath the accumulating earth, was not entirely empty of resonance. The stories that had been told in this uniform tradition did not disappear completely. They survived in transformed and fragmentary forms in later literatures, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Greek mythological tradition, in the Arabic and Persian literary traditions that drew on earlier sources in complex and often unacknowledged ways. The flood story, the creation narrative, the descent to the underworld, the wise king who sought immortality, these themes circulated in the cultural atmosphere of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world long after the cuneiform script had become unreadable, carried in oral tradition and in translated or adapted written forms. The figure of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water who kept secrets and helped humanity, left traces in later traditions that can be partially identified by scholars. The figure of a divine craftsman or trickster who mediates between the gods and humanity, who gives knowledge and tools to mortals, appears in Greek mythology as Prometheus, in Norse mythology as Loki, in various other traditions in forms that suggest a common archetype if not a direct borrowing. The stories are not the same, and the cultural contexts are very different, but the underlying pattern, the god who breaks ranks to help the humans, who pays a price for that help, who is both celebrated and punished, resonates across traditions in a way that suggests some deep structure of the human imagination. The sealed door, as a specific motif, does not have such clear parallels in later traditions, perhaps because it was too specifically rooted in the architectural and ritual practices of the Mesopotamian temple system to survive translation into other cultural frameworks. But the underlying idea, the idea of a threshold that must not be crossed, of knowledge that must not be sought, of a boundary established by divine authority that humans must respect, appears in many traditions in many forms. The forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, the box that Pandora must not open, the door in the castle that Bluebeard's wife must not unlock, these are all versions of the same fundamental narrative, and they all carry the same ambivalent charge, the simultaneous attraction and prohibition of the forbidden threshold. The recovery of the cuneiform tradition in the 19th and 20th centuries was therefore not simply the discovery of a lost civilization, it was the recovery of a set of root stories, foundational narratives that had shaped, directly or indirectly, much of the cultural and religious life of the ancient world, and whose echoes continue to be felt in later traditions. When George Smith announced the discovery of the Flood Tablet, the sensation it created was not just intellectual curiosity about a new ancient text. It was the shock of recognition, the feeling that something very old and very deep had been touched, that a door that had been sealed for 2,000 years had suddenly, unexpectedly been found again. The archaeological work continued after Smith's death, which came prematurely on a second expedition to Nineveh in 1876, when he died of illness in the field at the age of 36. Other scholars took up the work, and the pace of excavation and decipherment accelerated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The discovery of the site of Nippur by an American expedition beginning in the 1880s, and the recovery of thousands of tablets from the scribble school there, transformed the understanding of Sumerian literature and religion. The excavation of Ur by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s revealed the physical splendour of the Sumerian city at its height, including the royal tombs with their extraordinary wealth and their evidence of human sacrifice, a practice that added a dark and troubling dimension to the picture of Sumerian civilization. Each new excavation season brought new texts and new questions, and the field of Assyriology, as the study of the ancient Near East through its written records came to be called, grew into a substantial academic discipline with its own journals, its own training programs, its own debates and controversies. The questions being asked were not only about what the text said, but about what they meant, about the relationship between the mythological narratives and the historical realities they expressed or concealed, about the social and political functions of the religious traditions, about the nature of the beliefs held by the ordinary people as opposed to the trained specialists who produced the texts. The sealed door tablet occupied a specific and somewhat anomalous position in this scholarly landscape. It was not famous in the way that the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Code of Hammurabi was famous. It did not attract popular attention or inspire public exhibitions, but among specialists it was known, and it was cited in discussions of Mesopotamian ritual practice, of the theology of divine presence and withdrawal, and of the broader question of what the Anunnaki represented in the religious imagination of the ancient world. Outside the academic world, the tablet attracted a different kind of attention, from writers and thinkers who were interested in the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that the Anunnaki were not mythological figures but actual extraterrestrial beings who had visited Earth in the remote past and whose departure had been commemorated in the myths of divine withdrawal. This idea, popularized most extensively in the works of Zecharia Sitchin beginning in the 1970s, drew on genuine cuneiform texts, but interpreted them in ways that mainstream scholars found unpersuasive and methodologically flawed, reading mythological language as literal description and filling in gaps in the evidence with speculation presented as fact. The academic response to these interpretations has been consistently critical, noting that the cuneiform texts, read in their proper linguistic and cultural context, do not support the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and that the specific translations on which Sitchin and others relied were in many cases inaccurate or misleading. but the popular interest in the idea has persisted, and it has contributed to a broader public awareness of the Anunnaki and the cuneiform tradition that, whatever its scholarly limitations, has brought many people to an initial interest in ancient Mesopotamia who might otherwise never have encountered it. The genuine mystery of the Anunnaki, the mystery available in the actual cuneiform texts rather than in the speculative reinterpretations, is profound enough without any embellishment. These were the supreme divine figures of one of the most important civilizations in human history, beings whose names and deeds were preserved in the oldest written literature in the world, whose authority was invoked in the founding myths of civilization and in the daily rituals of the temple, and whose withdrawal from active presence in the human world was marked, according to the tradition, by the sealing of certain thresholds that have not been opened since. What that means, finally, is a question that the evidence cannot fully answer, but it is a question worth sitting with, in the quiet of the night, with the lamp burning low and the world outside settling into stillness. The story we've been following through these quiet hours, the story of the tablet that describes the door the Anunnaki sealed before they left, brings us finally to this moment, to this night, to the place where the ancient past and the immediate present meet in the act of listening, of attending, of allowing the old voices to speak again across the vast gulf of time that separates their world from ours. The tablet itself, the actual clay fragment with its wedge-shaped marks pressed by fingers that have been dust for 25 centuries, rests now in a climate-controlled case in the British Museum, one object among thousands in a collection that represents the patient work of generations of excavators, translators, and scholars who have dedicated their lives to the recovery of this lost world. The tablet says what it says, no more and no less than the cuneiform signs can reasonably be understood to mean, and what it says is both simple and profound. It describes a ritual performed in a temple in ancient Babylonia, a ritual that honoured a door sealed by divine authority in a time beyond memory, a ritual that maintained the boundary between the accessible and the inaccessible, between the world of human experience and the world of divine mystery. The tablet preserves, in the flat, procedural language of the temple manual, a moment of encounter between the human and the numinous, a moment when a priest descended into the depths of the sacred building and stood before a threshold he was forbidden to cross, acknowledging with lamp and incense and carefully spoken words the continuing presence of powers that had withdrawn from the surface of the world but had not departed entirely. Modern scholarship has given us the tools to read the tablet and to place it in the context of the broader literary and religious tradition from which it emerged. We can trace the theme of divine withdrawal through the myths of creation and flood, through the stories of Enki and Enlil and the assembly of the Anunnaki, through the hymns and laments and ritual texts that were copied and recopied across the millennia by scribes who understood that they were preserving something essential, something that would matter long after the particular cities and empires of their own time had crumbled and been forgotten. We can see the pattern, the way the ancient Mesopotamians understood their relationship to the divine as structured by boundaries, by distances, by the tension between closeness and separation that gives the sacred its particular character. But scholarship can only take us so far. The tablet emerges from a world that is not only distant in time but alien in its fundamental assumptions, its way of understanding what gods are, what humans are, what the relationship between them can be and should be. The people who performed the ritual of the sealed door lived in a cosmos that was animated by conscious powers, where the movements of the stars and the flooding of the rivers and the growth of the grain were not mechanical processes but expressions of divine will, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was fluid and permeable, where the idea that gods might walk among humans or withdraw behind sealed doors was not metaphorical but literal, part of the basic fabric of reality. That cosmos is not the cosmos of the modern world, and the god-inhabited universe of ancient Babylon is not the universe described by modern astronomy and physics and chemistry. The knowledge that has accumulated over the centuries since the last cuneiform tablet was written has given us a different picture of the structure of reality, one in which the movements of the planets are governed by gravity and orbital mechanics rather than by divine intention, where the flooding of rivers depends on precipitation and snowmelt, and topography rather than on the moods of Enlil, where the processes that shape the world are understood to be impersonal forces operating according to mathematical laws rather than personal powers acting according to will and desire. And yet, the questions that drove the ancient rituals, the questions about meaning and purpose, and the place of human life in the larger scheme of things, those questions remain. The longing for connection with something greater than oneself, the sense that there are thresholds in experience that touch the edge of mystery, the intuition that not everything can be explained or controlled or possessed. These are not ancient relics. They are part of the texture of contemporary life, felt as keenly now as they were felt by the priest who descended the narrow stair in the temple at Sippar and stood before the door that he could honour but never open. The archaeological work that has revealed the physical remains of the ancient Mesopotamian world continues, though under more difficult conditions than in the early heroic period of excavation. The political turbulence of the modern Middle East has made systematic excavation challenging in many of the most important sites, and the looting of museums and archaeological sites during periods of conflict has resulted in the loss of irreplaceable materials, tablets and artifacts scattered into the illegal antiquities trade, where they are separated from their context and their scholarly value is largely destroyed. But the work goes on, and new discoveries continue to be made, each one adding to the cumulative understanding of the ancient world, and sometimes revising or complicating the picture in important ways. The techniques available to modern archaeologists are far more sophisticated than those available to the pioneers of the 19th century. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, computer modelling, chemical analysis of artifacts, DNA analysis of organic remains, these tools can extract information from a site and from the objects found there that would have been unimaginable to the early excavators. The result is a much richer and more detailed picture of ancient life, not just the life of kings and priests, but the life of ordinary people, farmers and merchants and craftsmen, women and children, slaves and servants, whose existence was largely invisible in the written records, but whose material remains tell their own stories. The digital revolution has also transformed the study of the cuneiform texts themselves. High-resolution photography and three-dimensional scanning can capture details of the tablet surface that are invisible to the naked eye, revealing signs that have been worn or damaged beyond normal legibility. Computer databases can store and search through tens of thousands of texts, allowing scholars to trace the occurrence of particular words or phrases across the entire known corpus and to identify patterns and relationships that would be impossible to detect by manual methods. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are beginning to be applied to the problems of reading damaged texts and identifying fragments that belong together, work that would take human scholars decades to complete. The sealed door tablet has benefited from these new methods. Recent high-resolution imaging has revealed traces of additional text in areas where the surface damage had made the signs unreadable by conventional examination, and these newly revealed lines have clarified some aspects of the ritual description, while raising new questions about others. A computer search of the entire cuneiform database has identified several additional references to sealed doors and divine withdrawal that had not previously been connected to the theme, expanding the body of evidence and suggesting that the tradition was even more widespread than earlier scholarship had recognized. But for all the advances in technique and technology, the fundamental challenge remains the same. The cuneiform tablets are voices from a world that is profoundly different from our own, and the act of translation, of carrying meaning across the gap between one language and another, one culture and another, one worldview and another, is always an act of interpretation, always a bridge built from assumptions and guesswork as much as from solid evidence. The ancient scribes who pressed the tablets into clay were addressing readers who shared their cultural context, their religious assumptions, their daily familiarity with the physical and social environment in which the texts were produced. Modern readers come to the same texts as outsiders, foreigners, people who must learn not only the language but the entire framework of meaning within which the language operated. This is both the limitation and the opportunity of the scholarly encounter with the ancient world. The limitation is obvious, the gap that can never be fully bridged, the irreducible foreignness of a world separated from ours not only by time, but by fundamental differences in the way reality was understood and experienced. But the opportunity is also real, the chance to encounter ways of thinking and feeling and being that are genuinely different from our own, that can challenge and expand and enrich the range of human possibilities we take for granted. The ritual of the sealed door considered not as a historical curiosity, but as a human response to the mystery of existence, speaks to something that transcends its particular cultural context. The priest who descended into the depths of the temple, who approached the threshold with reverence and fear and wonder, who acknowledged the presence of powers beyond his understanding and maintained the boundary they had established, was engaged in an activity that has parallels in every religious tradition, in every spiritual practice that recognizes the sacred as something that must be approached with care, that cannot be possessed or controlled, that manifests itself precisely in the experience of limits, of boundaries, of the difference between what is available to human access and what remains forever hidden. The door itself, whether it was a physical door in an actual temple chamber or a symbolic representation of the threshold between the human and the divine, points to a fundamental structure of religious experience, the sense that the sacred is simultaneously present and absent, accessible and hidden, inviting and forbidding. The paradox is not accidental. It is intrinsic to the nature of the sacred as it is experienced by human consciousness, the way it reveals itself precisely by concealing itself, the way it makes itself known as that which cannot be known, approached as that which cannot be reached. This paradoxical structure appears in many forms across many traditions. In the Jewish temple, the Holy of Holies was a chamber that could be entered only once a year, by one person, under the most carefully prescribed conditions, and what was encountered there was not a presence but an absence, not the visible God but the place where God was said to dwell invisibly. In the Christian tradition, the central symbol is the cross, the place where the divine is revealed in the moment of its apparent abandonment, where the presence of God is made known through the cry of dereliction, the experience of being forsaken. In the Islamic tradition, the divine names include not only Rahman, the compassionate, but also Batin, the hidden, and the mystical goal is to approach the divine precisely through the recognition of its essential incomprehensibility. The Anunnaki of the Mesopotamian tradition, the gods who sealed the door before they left, are part of this same pattern. They are present in their absence, active in their withdrawal, powerful in their hiddenness. The door they sealed is not a barrier to their presence, but the condition of it, the way their power manifests itself not despite the seal but through the seal, not in spite of the boundary but as the boundary. This understanding suggests a way of reading the tablet that goes beyond the historical and anthropological questions, important as those are, and touches on the perennial questions of meaning and purpose that bring people to the study of the ancient world in the first place. The tablet is not just a document from a dead civilization, it is a record of a human encounter with mystery, preserved across the millennia in clay, and waiting to speak to anyone who has the patience to listen and the willingness to be addressed by voices from outside the immediate context of contemporary life. In the 21st century, in a world that is connected by digital networks but often divided by the very speed and scope of its connections, in a world where information is abundant but wisdom is scarce, in a world where the ancient certainties have been questioned and the new certainties have proven fragile, the voice of the ancient priest, descending into the temple depths to honor a door he cannot open, carries a particular resonance. His is the voice of someone who knows his place, who understands the boundaries of his authority, who can live with mystery without needing to solve it, who can approach the sacred without claiming to possess it. The ritual he performed was not an attempt to break through the seal or to discover what lay beyond the door. It was an act of maintenance, of keeping faith with a boundary established by higher authority, of maintaining the relationship between the human and the divine precisely by respecting the limits of that relationship. The priest was not trying to get closer to the gods. He was trying to maintain the proper distance, to keep the boundary clear and clean and intact, so that the cosmos could continue to function as it had been designed to function. There is something profoundly conservative about this vision, something that sits uneasily with the modern emphasis on exploration and discovery and the breaking of barriers. But there is also something deeply wise in it, a recognition that not all boundaries are arbitrary, that not all limits are meant to be transcended, that sometimes the proper human response to the sacred is not approach, but acknowledgement, not possession but reverence, not understanding but wonder. The tablet itself in its physical existence embodies this tension between accessibility and hiddenness. It is available to be read by anyone who learns the cuneiform script, translated in scholarly publications, discussed in academic conferences, displayed in museum exhibitions, and yet it remains in important ways sealed, carrying meanings that no amount of scholarly apparatus can fully unlock, pointing to experiences that no historical analysis can completely explain, preserving the memory of a world whose fundamental assumptions about reality are so different from our own that the act of translation is always an act of approximation. The building that housed the tablet, the temple at Sippar, is gone, reduced to a mound of rubble and debris that archaeologists have partially excavated and partially left for future investigation with better techniques and better questions. The door described in the tablet, if it ever existed as a physical door, has not been found, and it is unlikely that it ever will be found, given the destruction that the site has undergone over the centuries. The ritual described in the tablet is no longer performed. The priest who performed it has been dead for more than 2,000 years. The language in which the tablet was written is no longer spoken. The gods whose authority it acknowledges are no longer worshipped, and yet the tablet endures. The words pressed into clay by a scribe working in the lamplight of an ancient temple continue to speak to anyone who takes the time to listen. The questions the tablet addresses, the questions about the relationship between the human and the divine, about the nature of boundaries and thresholds, about the meaning of hiddenness and withdrawal, are questions that each generation must answer for itself, in its own terms, with its own resources, but that each generation must also inherit from the generations before, recognizing that the questions are older and larger than any particular historical moment. The priest who performed the ritual at the sealed door was maintaining a tradition that was already ancient in his time, already reaching back into the mythological past for its authorization and its meaning. The scribe who wrote the tablet was preserving that tradition for a future he could not imagine, trusting that the words he pressed into clay would matter to people he would never meet, in circumstances he could never foresee. The scholars who deciphered the tablet in the 19th and 20th centuries were recovering a voice that had been silent for 2 millennia, bringing it back into human consciousness and human conversation, making it available once again to participate in the ongoing human attempt to understand what it means to live in a world that contains both meaning and mystery. And now, in this moment, in the quiet of this night, the voice of the ancient priest, mediated through the scholarly work of generations of translators and interpreters, speaks again, speaks to you, speaks about the door that was sealed before the Great Ones departed, speaks about the boundary that must be honoured, speaks about the mystery that cannot be solved but can be acknowledged, can be approached with reverence, can be maintained with faithful attention across the centuries and the millennia until the time comes, if it ever comes, when the seal is broken and the door is opened and what lies beyond is finally revealed. But that time has not yet come. The seal holds, the boundary remains intact, the door stays closed, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the wisdom lies not in opening the door, but in keeping faith with the seal, not in breaking through the boundary, but in maintaining it, not in solving the mystery, but in honouring it, in allowing it to remain mysterious, in recognizing that some things are meant to be hidden, some knowledge is meant to be sealed away, some thresholds are not meant to be crossed. The lamp oil burns low in the temple chamber. The priest completes his ritual, makes his offering, recites his prayer, and withdraws. The door remains sealed. The Anunnaki, wherever they have gone, remain departed. The world continues its ancient rhythms. The rivers flow, the seasons turn, the stars follow their appointed paths, and the boundary between the human and the divine holds firm, neither too close nor too far, neither too permeable nor too absolute, but exactly where it needs to be, where it was placed by the wisdom that established it, where it will remain until the end of days or until the gods return, whichever comes first. The story has been told now, carried through the long night hours from its beginning, in the earliest days of writing to its culmination in this moment of listening, this act of attention paid to voices from the deep past. The same rivers that watered the fields of ancient Babylon still flow, though their courses have shifted and their banks have changed. The same stars that guided the Mesopotamian astronomers in their calculations still wheel overhead, though the meanings we assign to their movements are different from the meanings that the ancient stargazers found there. The same earth that supported the temple cities of Sumer and Akkad and Babylonia continues to turn, carrying with it the accumulated remains of all the civilizations that have risen and fallen on its surface, the tablets and the potsherds and the foundation stones and the dust of the people who shaped them. Let the fan turn softly in the corner and let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the weight of the day settle from your shoulders and let the concerns of tomorrow wait until tomorrow comes. The room grows quiet around you and the night stretches out beyond the windows, and somewhere in the darkness carried on the turning earth are the mounds that cover the ancient cities, the places where the tablets wait in silence, the thresholds that were sealed long ago and remain sealed still. Rest easy knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, that some doors are meant to stay closed, that the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the accessible and the hidden, between the world of everyday experience and the world of ultimate meaning continues to hold as it has always held, maintained by a wisdom deeper than human understanding and older than recorded time, while tomorrow waits patiently with its own steady rhythm to unfold whatever revelations or confirmations or quiet continuances the day will bring.